a death sentence commuted by the Mafia itself, a killing machine responsible for hundreds of murders, run with the discipline of a factory floor, an informant thrown from a guarded hotel window the night before he was set to testify, a civilian murdered simply for appearing on television. This is the real story of Albert Anastasia, and it makes the Corleones look gentle. Section 1. The boy the state meant to execute, Umberto Anastasio, was born on September 26, 1902, in Tropea, a small coastal town in Calabria, one of 12 children raised in a household where money never stretched far enough. His father worked the railroad, and when he died shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, the burden of feeding a house full of children fell entirely on a widow with no realistic way to manage it. Poverty in southern Italy during this period carried a particular grinding weight, and for boys growing up inside it, the paths available to them narrowed quickly to a handful of choices, none of them especially promising. Sicily and Calabria alike had spent generations exporting their poorest sons to wherever work could be found, and the Anastasio family's own situation differed from thousands of others across the region only in the specific details, not in the underlying desperation driving it. At 15, Umberto and several of his brothers took jobs aboard an Italian freighter, work that offered steady food and a wage, however modest, in exchange for labor most grown men would have found exhausting. Life aboard these ships demanded a particular toughness from boys barely out of childhood, long hours in cramped, dangerous conditions, and Anastasio absorbed this early education in hardship the same way countless other immigrant laborers of his generation did, treating physical endurance and a willingness to work through pain as simply the baseline cost of staying alive. When that ship eventually docked at the Brooklyn waterfront in 1919, the Anastasio brothers made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. They simply walked off the boat and never returned, disappearing into the crowded streets of a city that offered them nothing legally, but offered them everything in terms of opportunity, provided they were willing to take it through whatever means necessary. Brooklyn's waterfront in the years immediately following the First World War functioned as its own kind of lawless economy, dock workers competing constantly for jobs that shifted from day to day, controlled loosely by whichever men had enough muscle and enough nerve to enforce their own authority over who worked and who didn't. This was not an environment that rewarded patience or quiet negotiation. Hiring bosses handed out work assignments each morning to whichever men could physically intimidate their way to the front of the crowd, and disputes over who deserved a given job were settled with fists, clubs, and increasingly, with knives and firearms once the stakes grew large enough. Umberto, who would soon Americanize his name to Albert Anastasia, found his footing here almost immediately, developing a reputation for violence severe enough that other dock workers learned quickly not to cross him. This was not subtle criminal activity, conducted at a careful remove from consequence. This was open, physical intimidation carried out daily among men who had no illusions about what waited for them if they refused to fall in line. In 1921, at 19 years old, Anastasia was arrested for the murder of a fellow longshoreman named George Torino, a killing connected directly to the brutal competition over dock jobs that defined this world. He was convicted and sentenced to death, a sentence that should have ended his life in the electric chair within the year. What happened next reveals something that would define the entirety of Anastasia's subsequent career, a pattern this account will trace again and again across the decades that followed. The conviction was overturned on appeal after witnesses mysteriously changed their testimony or simply vanished, unwilling or unable to repeat what they had originally told investigators. Anastasia walked free, having learned, at 19 years old, exactly how completely intimidation and disappearance could unmake a case the state believed was airtight. This early brush with execution deserves particular attention, because it establishes a lesson Anastasia would apply with ruthless consistency for the remainder of his life. The American legal system, however confident it appeared on paper, depended entirely on witnesses willing to testify and willing to stay alive long enough to do so. Remove either condition, and the most serious charge in the world simply evaporated. Anastasia understood this at an age when most young men were still learning a trade, and he would spend the following 3.5 decades exploiting that exact vulnerability with an efficiency that eventually made him one of the most feared men in the entire history of American organized crime. There is a particular coldness worth sitting with in how young Anastasia actually was when he absorbed this lesson, a teenager who had walked away from a death sentence, not through some dramatic act of remorse or reform, but by watching the very machinery meant to punish him collapse under nothing more than fear applied to the right people. Freed from what should have been a certain death sentence, Anastasia returned to the docks and continued building his reputation. Arrested repeatedly throughout the 1920s, on charges ranging from illegal weapons possession to further homicide. Convictions that rarely held because the same pattern kept repeating itself. Witnesses recanted, witnesses disappeared. Cases collapsed before they ever reached a jury. Police officers who worked the waterfront during these years came to understand, with a kind of resigned frustration, that pursuing Anastasia through conventional legal channels amounted to a waste of department resources, since even the strongest cases assembled against him seemed to dissolve the moment they approached trial. By the time Prohibition had transformed organized crime into a genuinely national, enormously profitable enterprise, Anastasia had already established himself as exactly the kind of operator every ambitious criminal organization in New York wanted close to them, rather than working against them. A man whose willingness to kill carried no visible hesitation, and whose ability to escape consequence for that killing had already been proven under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Anastasia's specific value became clear during the Castellamarese War, the violent struggle for control of New York's Italian-American underworld that erupted in 1930 between Giuseppe Masseria, the established boss known as Joe the Boss, and Salvatore Maranzano, the leader of a rival faction drawing its strength from immigrants connected to the Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo. Anastasia aligned himself with the faction working to end Masseria's reign, and he became one of the men directly involved in the killing that finally decided the war's outcome. On April 15, 1931, Masseria was shot dead while eating lunch at a restaurant in Coney Island, killed by men who included Anastasia among their number, a betrayal orchestrated from within Masseria's own camp by a younger operator named Charles Luciano, who had already concluded his own future depended on switching sides before the war destroyed him, along with his boss. This single killing placed Anastasia directly inside the founding moment of what would become the modern American Mafia's governing structure. Luciano's victory led to the formation of the Commission, the governing council of family bosses, meant to prevent exactly the kind of destructive, prolonged warfare that had just consumed the city for 2 years. Anastasia, having proven his value through direct, personal participation in the killing that made this new structure possible, found himself positioned close to genuine power from the very beginning of this new order, working alongside men, including Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello, relationships that would define the rest of his career and eventually determine the exact manner of his own death decades later. It is worth pausing on the strange symmetry embedded in this early alliance, since the very method Anastasia helped perfect against Masseria, a trusted insider quietly deciding the boss no longer served his interests, and acting decisively before anyone could react, would return to claim Anastasia's own life a quarter-century later, delivered by men who had learned from watching exactly what he himself had once helped accomplish. What set Anastasia apart from many of his contemporaries during these early years was not simply his willingness to kill, since this account has already traced that willingness back to his very first arrest as a teenager on the Brooklyn docks. It was the specific combination of that willingness, with an almost total absence of any documented hesitation or remorse, a quality that other men within this world, however violent themselves, found genuinely unsettling. Anastasia did not approach killing as a regrettable necessity of the business, the way some of the more calculating figures in this same underworld like to frame it. He approached it, according to multiple accounts from people who worked alongside him, with something closer to genuine, uncomplicated enthusiasm, a man who seemed to derive real satisfaction from the act itself, rather than simply tolerating it as the cost of advancement. Associates who spent time around him during this period described a man capable of laughing and joking moments before or after ordering someone's death, a casualness that unsettled even hardened criminals who had themselves killed without particular remorse. By the early 1930s, this reputation had already earned Anastasia control over significant portions of the Brooklyn waterfront rackets, giving him influence over one of the busiest and most economically important ports in the entire country. Dock workers' unions, cargo movement, and the enormous flow of goods through New York Harbor all passed, in one way or another, through channels Anastasia and his associates controlled, a position of genuine economic power built directly on top of the same intimidation and violence that had first gotten him arrested for murder as a teenager. Legitimate businesses shipping goods through the port found themselves paying tribute in one form or another, whether through inflated union dues, mandatory kickbacks, or simple protection payments, and refusal carried consequences that rarely required much imagination to anticipate. This waterfront empire would remain under Anastasia family control for decades, a detail that becomes especially significant later in this history, since his own brother, Anthony, nicknamed Tough Tony, would continue running these same operations long after Albert's own death, a legacy of intimidation passed down through blood in a manner this account will return to. The nickname that would eventually attach itself most permanently to Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, had not yet fully taken hold during these early years, though the reputation underlying it had already formed completely. Men who dealt with Anastasia during this period consistently described him in terms that emphasized his volatility, a hair-trigger temper capable of shifting from calm conversation to explosive violence with almost no warning, a quality that made him simultaneously valuable and genuinely dangerous to be around, even for the other criminals who considered themselves his allies. Colleagues learned to read his moods carefully, understanding that a perfectly ordinary conversation could turn lethal within seconds if Anastasia decided, often for reasons that made sense only to him, that some slight had occurred that demanded an immediate and violent response. This volatility would eventually prove central to his own downfall decades later. But during these formative years, it functioned almost entirely to his advantage, cementing a reputation that meant few people, criminal or otherwise, dared to test him directly. What makes this origin story worth setting against the popular imagination of organized crime is precisely how little romance or code of honor actually appears anywhere within it. There was no dignified induction, no solemn oath sworn before an assembled family, no mentor figure teaching a reluctant young man the delicate balance between business and violence. There was a poor boy from Calabria who jumped a ship because staying meant continued poverty, who killed a fellow laborer over competition for dock work at 19 years old, who escaped a death sentence not through any demonstration of remorse or reform, but through the same intimidation tactics that had gotten him arrested in the first place, and who spent the following decade proving, case after case, that the American legal system could be dismantled with sufficient patience and sufficient willingness to make witnesses disappear. This was the actual foundation beneath everything that followed, considerably colder and considerably less cinematic than anything a Hollywood screenplay would ever choose to open with, a beginning built entirely on survival, intimidation, and a young man's discovery that the machinery of justice could be defeated by anyone patient enough to remove the people it depended on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section follows what happened once that lesson became the founding principle of an entire killing operation built for the whole underworld to use. Section 2. A factory built to kill. By the mid-1930s, the loose network of enforcers and hitmen scattered across New York's various criminal organizations had begun to formalize into something considerably more organized, and Albert Anastasia stood at the very center of that transformation. The specific arrangement that emerged became known eventually to the press as Murder Incorporated, a name that captured, with unintentional precision, exactly how methodically this operation actually functioned. This was not a loose collection of angry men settling scores when the mood struck them. This was a centralized, professionally managed killing service, available to any of the major crime families willing to pay for its use, and Anastasia sat near the very top of its command structure, overseeing contract killings that spanned not merely New York, but reached into cities across the entire country. The origins of this arrangement traced back to the same governing commission that Anastasia had helped bring into existence through his own participation in Masseria's assassination. Charles Luciano and his allies understood that maintaining peace between the newly organized five families required some mechanism for enforcing discipline without triggering the kind of prolonged, destructive warfare that had just consumed the city for 2 years during the Castellamarese conflict. The solution they settled on involved creating a dedicated enforcement arm, staffed by killers loyal to the Commission's collective interests rather than to any single family, available whenever a boss needed a problem solved with the kind of finality that only death could provide. Louis Buchalter, known as Lepke, is generally credited as the operation's original architect, But it was Anastasia who provided much of its operational leadership and its enforcement muscle, coordinating hits with an efficiency that impressed even hardened criminals who had seen plenty of violence in their own careers. The scale of what this organization actually accomplished deserves careful attention, because it separates Murder Incorporated from almost any comparable criminal enterprise examined anywhere else in this broader history of organized crime. Conservative estimates place the total number of killings connected to the operation somewhere above 500, with some historians suggesting the true figure may have exceeded 1,000 once every contract carried out across its full decade of active operation is accounted for. These were not killings scattered randomly across years of ordinary criminal business. They were carried out with an almost industrial regularity, contracts accepted, assignments distributed to specific killers based on their particular skills, and payments settled once the job had been verified complete. A business model that treated human death with the same procedural detachment a legitimate company might apply to fulfilling orders for any other product or service. Anastasia's own base of operations for this enterprise centered on a candy store in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, a densely populated neighborhood home to hundreds of thousands of working-class Jewish immigrant families during this period. The choice of location was deliberate and practical rather than incidental. A modest storefront candy shop drew no particular attention from police or curious neighbors, providing perfect cover for men to gather, receive instructions, and disperse without arousing suspicion. From this unassuming base, killers connected to the organization carried out assignments using whatever tools the specific job required. Ice picks, ropes, knives, and firearms all featured regularly in the organization's work, chosen not for dramatic effect, but for whatever method best suited the circumstances of a particular target and location. Several individual killers rose to particular prominence within this operation, their names becoming, within the specific world of organized crime, almost as recognizable as the bosses who employed them. Harry Strauss, known as Pittsburgh Phil, developed a reputation as one of the organization's most prolific and most methodical killers, reportedly involved in dozens of murders carried out with a chilling professional consistency. Abe Reles, nicknamed Kid Twist, functioned as one of the operation's key organizers and enforcers, a man whose own eventual decision to cooperate with authorities would trigger consequences this account will trace in the section immediately following. Frank Abendondo, known as the Dasher, and Martin Goldstein, called Bugsy, rounded out the group of killers most closely associated with the organization's daily operations, each bringing his own particular methods and reputation to an enterprise that, however monstrous in its actual function, operated with a level of internal discipline and division of labor that would have been recognizable to any legitimate business owner managing a specialized workforce. What distinguished Anastasia's specific role within this structure from an ordinary participant was his position, overseeing operational security and maintaining the kind of insulation from direct prosecution that had already protected him throughout his earlier years on the Brooklyn docks. Anastasia understood, better than almost anyone else connected to this enterprise, exactly how criminal prosecutions actually succeeded or failed, and he applied that understanding systematically to protect both himself and the operation as a whole. Killers were selected carefully for specific jobs based on whether they had any prior connection to the intended target, minimizing the kind of obvious motive that might otherwise draw immediate police attention. Weapons were disposed of immediately following each job, denying investigators the physical evidence that might eventually connect a specific killing to a specific perpetrator. And perhaps most importantly, Anastasia maintained enough personal distance from the actual physical execution of most contracts that even when investigators strongly suspected his involvement in a particular killing, they rarely possessed evidence sufficient to bring formal charges that could actually survive contact with a courtroom. This operational discipline meant that despite widespread knowledge among both law enforcement and the broader underworld that Anastasia commanded significant authority over Murder Incorporated's activities, he remained remarkably insulated from prosecution throughout the entire period the organization operated at its height. Detectives and prosecutors who worked organized crime cases during the 1930s came to view Anastasia with a particular, frustrated respect, recognizing him as one of the most dangerous men in the entire city, while simultaneously acknowledging that building a case against him that could actually reach trial represented an almost impossible task given how thoroughly he had learned to insulate himself from the direct evidence prosecutors needed. The victims of Murder Incorporated's work spanned a genuinely wide range of categories, reflecting the operation's function as a service, available to any family or boss willing to pay for it, rather than a personal vendetta machine serving Anastasia's own narrow interests alone. Rival gangsters who threatened the stability the Commission wanted to maintain across the underworld represented one significant category of target. Informants who had begun cooperating with authorities, or who were merely suspected of considering it, represented another, and this particular category would eventually prove most consequential for understanding exactly how thoroughly this organization prioritized its own survival above any other consideration. Businessmen who refused to cooperate with extortion demands, labor union officials who resisted mob influence over their organizations, and occasionally individuals whose deaths served no purpose beyond satisfying a particular boss's personal grievance, all found their way onto the list of contracts this organization fulfilled across its decade of active operation. There is a particular detail worth examining closely here, because it illustrates something important about how thoroughly Anastasia and his associates had abandoned any pretense of operating according to a code with actual limits. Popular depictions of organized crime frequently suggest an unwritten rule protecting civilians and ordinary people who had no direct connection to the criminal underworld, a boundary supposedly observed even by the most violent figures within this world. Murder Incorporated's actual operational history reveals this boundary to have been considerably more porous than the popular imagination generally assumes, a detail this account will examine in far greater and more specific depth once it reaches the killing of Arnold Schuster, an entirely innocent civilian whose only offense was cooperating with police in an entirely unrelated matter. That killing, still years away from the period this section is currently examining, would eventually demonstrate with brutal clarity exactly how little Anastasia himself actually respected the supposed limits his own organization claimed to observe. The financial mechanics underlying Murder Incorporated deserve attention as well, because they illustrate the specifically commercial character of an enterprise that has often been romanticized in popular retellings as something closer to tribal warfare between rival clans. Bosses seeking a specific killing paid directly for the service, with fees varying according to the difficulty and risk involved in a particular assignment. This payment structure meant that Anastasia and the organization's other senior figures accumulated genuine, substantial wealth through their management of the enterprise, wealth that Anastasia would eventually use to construct an enormous estate in Fort Lee, New Jersey, a stucco and tile mansion offering sprawling views back toward the city, while maintaining enough physical distance to function as a genuine, peaceful retreat from the violence that had actually built it. The contrast between the mansion's tranquil setting and the specific business that financed its construction captures something essential about how thoroughly this world had learned to separate its most brutal work from the comfortable, ordinary lives its practitioners built for themselves once the money started flowing. Law enforcement's eventual breakthrough against this organization came not through any conventional investigative triumph, but through exactly the same vulnerability Anastasia himself had exploited as a teenager escaping his own death sentence, a willing witness whose testimony could actually survive to reach a courtroom. Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer began building a genuine case against Murder Incorporated in the late 1930s, understanding that convicting individual killers for individual crimes would do little to address an organization this deeply networked and this well-insulated from direct evidence. What O'Dwyer actually needed was an insider willing to testify from direct personal knowledge, someone who had participated closely enough in the organization's operations to name names, describe specific killings, and connect the scattered evidence investigators had already assembled into something resembling a coherent, prosecutable narrative. That insider arrived in the person of Abe Reles, arrested in 1940, and persuaded, through a combination of pressure and genuine self-interest, to begin cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for consideration regarding his own considerable legal exposure. Reles's decision to cooperate represented exactly the kind of catastrophic security failure this organization had spent years successfully avoiding. An insider with genuine, detailed knowledge of the enterprise's inner workings, choosing his own survival over continued loyalty to the men he had once served alongside. His testimony over the following months provided prosecutors with precisely the kind of comprehensive, corroborated account of Murder Incorporated's actual structure and operations that had previously remained frustratingly out of reach, connecting specific killings directly to the men who had ordered them and the men who had carried them out. Relis's cooperation produced genuine, significant results almost immediately. Several of the organization's most prolific killers, including Harry Strauss and Martin Goldstein, were convicted and eventually executed, based substantially on testimony Relis provided. A genuinely unprecedented breakthrough against an enterprise that had previously seemed almost entirely immune to conventional prosecution. Louis Buchalter, the organization's original architect, would eventually be convicted and executed as well, based on evidence and testimony that Relis's cooperation had helped unlock. For the first time in the entire history of this specific operation, the machinery of American justice was actually succeeding at the exact task Anastasia had spent his entire adult life proving impossible, holding organized killers accountable through the ordinary functioning of courts and juries, rather than watching cases dissolve through intimidation and disappearing witnesses the way every previous prosecution against him personally had always eventually unfolded. What made Relis's continued cooperation so genuinely dangerous to Anastasia specifically was the scope of what he actually knew and was apparently willing to share. Relis possessed direct, detailed knowledge connecting Anastasia himself to numerous killings carried out under the Murder Incorporated banner, exactly the kind of first-hand, corroborated testimony that had never previously existed against him, despite decades of suspected involvement in murder after murder. For the first time since his own teenage brush with a death sentence, Anastasia faced the genuine possibility that his own carefully maintained insulation from prosecution might finally collapse, undone by precisely the same mechanism, a cooperating witness willing to testify in open court, that had always represented the single greatest vulnerability facing any criminal organization built on this world's specific combination of violence and enforced silence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Relis knew enough to end Anastasia's career entirely, and he was scheduled to testify to exactly that effect. The next section follows what happened to him the night before he was set to take the stand, guarded by police in a room 6 floors above the ground. Section 3. The Canary Who Could Sing But Couldn't Fly. Abe Relis sat in protective custody through the winter of 1940 and into 1941, guarded around the clock by police officers, whose job was to keep him alive long enough to testify against the very organization he had spent years helping to run. This arrangement itself represented something genuinely unusual within the specific history of Murder Incorporated's prosecution, an admission by the district attorney's own office that the threat facing a cooperating witness in this world extended considerably beyond the ordinary risks any informant might reasonably expect to face. Relis was not simply a low-level associate whose testimony carried modest weight against minor figures within the organization. He was, by every meaningful measure, the single most valuable and most dangerous witness the government had ever managed to produce against this specific criminal enterprise, a man whose detailed, first-hand knowledge connected directly to Albert Anastasia himself. The specific value of Relis's cooperation cannot be overstated within the context this account has already established. He had participated closely enough in the organization's actual operations to provide investigators with names, dates, methods, and motives behind dozens of individual killings, transforming what had previously existed only as widespread suspicion and rumor into something resembling a fully documented criminal enterprise a court could actually act upon. His testimony had already helped convict and eventually execute several of the organization's most notorious killers, men including Harry Strauss and Martin Goldstein, whose own considerable body counts had finally caught up with them once Relis began describing their specific involvement in specific murders, with the kind of granular, corroborated detail that no amount of witness intimidation could easily unravel. What made Relis's continued cooperation so uniquely threatening to Anastasia specifically was the scope of what remained still to come. Relis had already testified in several previous trials connected to Murder Incorporated's activities, but his most significant, most consequential testimony remains scheduled for the future, aimed directly at connecting Anastasia himself to specific murders in a way that had never previously been achieved through any prior prosecution. Louis Buchalter, the organization's original architect, was also scheduled to face trial based substantially on evidence Relis's cooperation had helped assemble, meaning that a single witness held within his own memory the capacity to end the careers, and quite possibly the lives, of the 2 most senior figures connected to this entire enterprise. District Attorney William O'Dwyer's office understood the stakes involved in protecting Relis well enough to establish an unusually elaborate security arrangement, one that reflected genuine institutional awareness of exactly how far organized crime had historically been willing to go to eliminate a threat of this magnitude. Relis, along with several other cooperating witnesses, including Albert Tannenbaum, Mickey Sykoff, and Sholem Bernstein, was housed in a suite of rooms on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel, a large seaside establishment overlooking the Coney Island boardwalk in Brooklyn. Each witness occupied his own individual room within this protected section, and officers reporting directly to the district attorney's office maintained a continuous presence throughout the suite, a security detail specifically assembled to prevent exactly the kind of retaliation this organization had already demonstrated it was fully capable of carrying out against anyone who threatened its survival. The specific arrangement of this protective detail deserves careful examination, because the gaps within it would eventually prove decisive. Guards maintained positions throughout the 10-room section housing the witnesses, but the instructions given to officers stationed on the hotel's main floor were reportedly vague, described only in general terms as watching for suspicious individuals, rather than following any more rigorous, specific protocol. This looseness, in an otherwise seemingly thorough security arrangement, would later become one of the central, unresolved questions surrounding everything that happened next, a detail that multiple investigators and historians examining this case in the decades since have returned to again and again, while attempting to understand exactly how a supposedly protected witness could have died under circumstances that remain genuinely difficult to explain through any innocent account of events. On the morning of November 12, 1941, sometime between 3 and 6:30 in the morning, Abe Relis either jumped, fell, or was pushed from the window of room 623, the room where he had been housed under continuous police protection. He was found dead on the roof of a 2-story kitchen extension attached to the hotel, having fallen approximately 42 feet from his 6th-floor window. Hotel staff who discovered the body found him lying on his back, his suit jacket still fully buttoned, with 2 knotted bedsheets tangled partially around his legs. Investigators who responded to the scene also discovered a length of insulated electrical wire tied to a radiator valve inside Relis's room, trailing out through the open window, apparently connected to the sheets found near his body. The official explanation offered by authorities arrived quickly and followed a specific, seemingly coherent narrative. According to this account, Relis had attempted to lower himself from his 6th-floor window down to a 5th-floor window below, using a makeshift rope constructed from the knotted sheets and the length of electrical wire tied to his own radiator. The wire, according to this explanation, had either come loose from its attachment point or simply proven insufficient to bear his weight, causing him to fall the remaining distance to his death. This explanation was formally recorded as the official cause of death, an accident occurring during what investigators characterized as either an escape attempt or, in an even less plausible version of events that circulated at the time, some kind of elaborate prank Relis had apparently decided to attempt while under 24-hour police guard hours before testimony that would determine the fate of the 2 most powerful men connected to his entire criminal career. Almost nobody who examined the actual physical details of this death found the official explanation genuinely credible, and the specific reasons for this skepticism deserve careful attention because they illustrate exactly why this case has remained one of the most persistently suspicious deaths in the entire history of American organized crime prosecution. Relis was reportedly known among his own associates to have a genuine, significant fear of heights, a detail that sits awkwardly beside any theory suggesting he voluntarily chose to dangle himself out of a 6th-floor window using nothing more than knotted bed sheets and a length of ordinary electrical wire. He was also, by every account of his own professional history, a man with genuine expertise in exactly the kind of practical criminal skills that would have made him considerably more capable than an ordinary person at constructing a rope or securing a knot that could actually bear his own weight, a skill set that made the reported failure of his supposed escape apparatus seem considerably less like simple bad luck and considerably more like a detail someone had arranged specifically to fail. The physical positioning of Relis's body relative to the hotel's exterior wall raised additional, genuinely serious questions that investigators at the time struggled to fully resolve. Multiple observers who examined the scene noted that his body had come to rest a considerable distance from the base of the building, a trajectory that struck several journalists and investigators as more consistent with someone being physically thrown from the window with real force than with a person simply losing his grip while attempting to lower himself down along the wall's surface. This detail alone would not necessarily prove foul play on its own terms, but combined with Relis's documented fear of heights and his own considerable practical skill with exactly the kind of knot tying his supposed escape attempt required, the physical evidence collectively pointed toward a conclusion considerably darker than the official account was willing to acknowledge. Perhaps the single most damning detail undermining the official explanation involves the presence and conduct of the police officers specifically assigned to protect Relis around the clock. 6 separate officers maintained guard duty over the protected suite housing Relis and the other cooperating witnesses, a level of security that should have made any genuine escape attempt, let alone a successful murder disguised as one, almost impossible to execute without at least some officer noticing unusual activity. That 6 trained police officers, specifically assigned to prevent exactly this kind of outcome, somehow failed to notice or prevent Relis's death, under circumstances requiring considerable time, effort, and noise to actually construct the elaborate rope apparatus investigators discovered, struck contemporary observers and later historians alike as difficult to accept as innocent oversight. Widespread rumor and subsequent investigation pointed toward a specific, considerably darker possible explanation for how this security failure actually occurred. Multiple accounts examining the case in the decades since have suggested that Frank Costello, working on behalf of interests aligned with protecting Anastasia specifically, arranged for a substantial bribe, with figures cited in various accounts reaching as high as $100,000, paid directly to some or all of the officers responsible for guarding Relis that night. Under this theory, the guards did not simply fail to prevent Relis's death through carelessness or incompetence. They were paid, quite specifically, to look away at the exact moment someone else entered the room and ensured that Relis would never actually testify against Anastasia or Buchalter at all. This theory, while never formally proven in any court of law, and therefore requiring genuine caution before being presented as established fact, aligns closely with the broader pattern this account has already traced across Anastasia's entire adult life: a consistent, demonstrated willingness to use intimidation, bribery, and outright murder to eliminate exactly the kind of threat Relis represented, combined with a track record extending back to his own teenage years that showed considerable skill at making witnesses and evidence simply disappear before they could ever reach a courtroom. Whether Anastasia personally ordered this specific killing, or whether it was carried out by allies acting on his behalf without his own direct involvement in the planning, the underlying motive remained the same regardless of exactly which hands ultimately arranged it. Relis's death eliminated the single greatest threat to Anastasia's own continued freedom that had ever existed up to that point in his entire criminal career, arriving with a timing so precise, hours before scheduled testimony that would have directly implicated him, that even observers reluctant to assume the worst found genuine coincidence almost impossible to accept as a satisfying explanation. The consequences of Relis's death extended considerably beyond simply protecting Anastasia from the immediate legal threat his testimony represented. Without Relis available to testify, the case connecting Anastasia directly to specific murders collapsed entirely, and he would never again face prosecution with evidence anywhere near as comprehensive or as personally damning as what Relis had been prepared to offer. The broader message sent to every other potential informant watching this case unfold proved, if anything, even more consequential than the specific legal outcome for Anastasia personally. Relis had done everything the government's own protective apparatus supposedly required to keep a cooperating witness alive: 24-hour guard, a secure hotel suite, careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, and none of it had actually mattered once the specific interest threatened by his testimony decided his continued survival was unacceptable. The phrase that emerged from this specific case, describing Relis as the canary who could sing but couldn't fly, captured something considerably darker than simple gallows humor. It captured a genuine, widely understood lesson about exactly how far organized crime's reach actually extended, into guarded hotel rooms, past assigned police protection, defeating even the most careful institutional safeguards the state could construct around a witness it desperately needed to keep alive. District Attorney William O'Dwyer, whose own career had been built substantially on the prosecution's Relis's cooperation made possible, would go on to become mayor of New York City in the years following this case, a career trajectory that some observers examining this period have suggested reflected a considerably more complicated, delicate relationship between law enforcement, city politics, and organized crime than the official record of vigorous prosecution ever fully acknowledged. Whether O'Dwyer's own subsequent political success connects in any direct, provable way to the specific circumstances surrounding Relis's death remains, like so much else in this case, a matter of persistent suspicion rather than established fact. But the broader pattern it suggests, a system where the machinery meant to hold organized crime accountable, frequently proved considerably more permeable and considerably more compromised than its public presentation ever admitted, runs directly through the center of everything this account has traced about Anastasia's own remarkable, decades-long survival against a legal system that should have caught him dozens of times over. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Relis died with everything he knew about Anastasia still locked inside him, silenced hours before it could ever reach a jury. The next section follows Anastasia years later, ordering a killing against a man who had never committed a single crime in his entire life. Section 4. The man who was only guilty of being on television. Arnold Schuster was 24 years old in February 1952, working as a clothing salesman and living with his parents in the Borough Park section of Brooklyn. An ordinary young man whose entire life up to that point had unfolded with no connection whatsoever to organized crime, to violence, or to anything resembling the world this account has traced across its preceding sections. What happened to him over the following month, and the specific reasoning behind it, represents perhaps the single most damning illustration available anywhere in this history of exactly how completely Albert Anastasia had abandoned even the most basic limits that other, equally violent men within his own world still generally observed. On February 18, 1952, Schuster was riding the New York City subway home when he noticed a fellow passenger who looked remarkably familiar. Willie Sutton, known within both law enforcement circles and the broader public imagination as Willie the Actor, had built a genuine national reputation as one of the most skilled bank robbers in the entire country, a man whose combination of careful planning and elaborate disguises had made him a recurring subject of newspaper coverage for years. Sutton had escaped from prison in 1947 alongside several other inmates and had remained a fugitive ever since, wanted across multiple jurisdictions for a string of bank robberies that had frustrated law enforcement for years. Schuster, recognizing Sutton from newspaper photographs and wanted posters, made a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. Rather than simply continuing on with his own evening, he followed Sutton off the subway car, tracking him at a careful distance to a garage where Sutton appeared to be attending to his own vehicle. When Schuster spotted a police car passing nearby, he approached the officers directly and told them he believed the man working on a stalled car down the block was the wanted fugitive Willie Sutton. This tip led directly to Sutton's arrest, ending a manhunt that had stretched across years and multiple states. And Schuster, an ordinary young man with no prior connection to any of this, suddenly found himself thrust into a level of media attention he had never sought and could not have anticipated when he first recognized a familiar face on a crowded subway train. He met the police commissioner. He gave interviews to local newspapers. He appeared on television, discussing the specific sequence of events that had led to Sutton's capture, describing with evident, understandable pride exactly how he had spotted the fugitive and made the decision to alert authorities. This media attention, however innocent and however understandable given the genuine, significant public service Schuster had just performed, brought him directly into contact with a specific, unwritten rule this account has already traced governing organized crime's own internal culture, an absolute prohibition against cooperating with law enforcement that applied, in the minds of men like Anastasia, considerably more broadly than most ordinary citizens could have possibly anticipated. Sutton himself, despite being a wanted fugitive, commanded genuine respect and even admiration within segments of the underworld, reportedly known among criminals for a personal code that avoided violence during his own robberies, a detail that made his capture, and Schuster's role in bringing it about, land with particular resentment among people who considered Sutton something closer to a folk hero than an ordinary criminal deserving no special consideration. According to testimony that would not actually emerge publicly until more than a decade later, Albert Anastasia happened to see one of Schuster's television interviews and reacted with an anger that seems, examined against everything else this account has established about his character, entirely consistent with the volatility and hair-trigger temper that had defined him since his earliest years on the Brooklyn docks. Joseph Valachi, testifying before the McClellan Committee hearings in 1963 as part of his own extraordinary decision to break the underworld's code of silence and publicly confirm the Mafia's existence for the first time, specifically claimed that Anastasia had ordered Schuster's death purely out of irritation at watching the young man discuss his own role in Sutton's capture on television, reportedly exclaiming that he could not stand looking at, in his own words, this bum informer being celebrated as a hero. The specific details of this claim deserve careful, honest examination here, because this account has an obligation to present the genuine uncertainties surrounding it, rather than treating Valachi's testimony as definitively established fact, simply because it aligns with the broader pattern this history has traced. Valachi's account arrived secondhand, based on information he claimed to have heard from other sources, rather than direct personal knowledge of Anastasia's own private conversations, and prosecutors examining his testimony at the time reportedly characterized elements of his account as hearsay derived from sources that could not be independently verified. Law enforcement officials investigating the case in the years immediately following Schuster's actual murder described some competing theories, including the persistent possibility that Sutton's own associates, rather than Anastasia, had ordered the killing in retaliation for Schuster's role in the arrest, or that some other combination of motives entirely had actually driven the decision. What remains beyond serious dispute, regardless of exactly which specific version of the underlying motive proves most accurate, is the basic sequence of events that actually followed. On March 8, 1952, Arnold Schuster was shot multiple times outside his own home in Brooklyn by a lone gunman, struck twice in the groin and once in each eye, in a manner that struck investigators at the time as carrying a particular, deliberate symbolism, a punishment apparently intended to convey a specific message about looking too closely and talking too much, rather than simply killing him through whatever method happened to be most convenient. Schuster died from these wounds, an entirely ordinary young man whose only offense, whatever the actual underlying motive driving his killers, had been performing exactly the kind of basic civic duty that police departments across the entire country generally hoped ordinary citizens would feel comfortable performing without fear of lethal retaliation. The specific identity of the gunman himself connects directly back to organized crime's own internal networks in a manner that reinforces the broader theory implicating Anastasia. Frederick Tenuto, identified and eventually named as the likely shooter, had been one of the same inmates who escaped prison alongside Sutton back in 1947, placing him within exactly the kind of criminal network that would have carried genuine motive to punish Schuster for his role in ending Sutton's years as a fugitive. According to the account Valachi later provided, Anastasia himself subsequently ordered Tenuto's own murder as well, eliminating the gunman specifically to prevent him from ever revealing who had actually commissioned Schuster's killing in the first place. A pattern of eliminating the very people used to carry out violence once their continued existence represented a liability rather than an asset. A pattern this broader history of organized crime has traced repeatedly across other criminal organizations and other decades, entirely separate from Anastasia's own specific story. Tenuto himself was never definitively located or confirmed dead by authorities, remaining on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for an extraordinary 14 years, from 1950 until 1964, a fugitive whose ultimate fate has never been conclusively established through any official investigation. This detail adds yet another layer of genuine, unresolved mystery to a case that already contained considerable ambiguity regarding motive, and it illustrates something this broader account has already traced as a recurring pattern throughout organized crime's history: the deliberate, calculated elimination of loose ends that leaves investigators permanently unable to construct the kind of complete, fully corroborated account that might otherwise allow a case like this to reach genuine legal resolution decades after the fact. The murder of Arnold Schuster produced a reaction within New York's broader public and political establishment that differed considerably from the reception given to countless other organized crime killings this account has traced across earlier sections. Killings among criminals, however violent or however frequent, tended to generate a particular kind of grim, resigned coverage in the press, an acknowledgement that men who chose this world accepted certain risks as the cost of the life they had selected for themselves. Schuster's death generated something categorically different, genuine public horror, and outrage at the killing of an entirely innocent civilian whose only crime had been cooperating with police in an entirely ordinary, entirely admirable way. This distinction mattered enormously within the underworld itself, and this account's earlier examination of how the wider commission eventually turned against Anastasia will trace directly back to this specific killing as one of the central grievances that convinced even his own hardened peers that his continued leadership had become genuinely intolerable. There is a particular detail worth sitting with here, one that captures something essential about exactly how completely Anastasia's own specific character diverged from any romanticized version of organized crime loyalty or restraint. Multiple criminal organizations examined across this broader history of organized crime maintained, at least in theory, some rough boundary protecting ordinary civilians who had no direct connection to the criminal underworld, a limit that even men fully capable of extreme violence within their own professional context generally chose to respect. Understanding that killing innocent, uninvolved people invited exactly the kind of intense, sustained public and law enforcement attention that made continued criminal operation considerably more difficult for everyone connected to the underworld, not merely the individual responsible for the specific killing. Anastasia's decision to order Schuster's death, whether driven by simple, uncontrolled irritation at watching a television interview or by some more calculated motive, this account cannot fully establish with complete certainty, demonstrated a willingness to cross exactly this line, and to cross it over something as genuinely trivial as personal annoyance, rather than any serious threat to his own operations or safety. This willingness to kill an innocent person over what amounted to little more than wounded pride illustrates, with particular clarity, exactly why Anastasia's own eventual downfall would come not primarily from law enforcement, which had already failed repeatedly across decades to hold him meaningfully accountable for anything, but from within his own criminal world, from men who had watched his escalating recklessness with growing alarm and had begun concluding that his continued leadership represented a genuine liability to everyone connected to him. The specific chain of grievances that would eventually produce the Commission's decision to approve his removal, a decision this account will trace in considerably greater detail across the sections still ahead, drew directly and substantially from the horror that even hardened. Violent men felt at learning what Anastasia had apparently done to an innocent young clothing salesman whose only real offense had been recognizing a wanted fugitive on a crowded subway car, and doing exactly what any ordinary, well-meaning citizen might reasonably have chosen to do in his position. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section follows the growing list of grievances building against Schuster, and the specific business decision that finally convinced even his closest allies he could no longer be trusted. Section 5. The bosses he killed to become boss. Albert Anastasia did not simply inherit control of a crime family through some orderly, sanctioned transfer of power. He seized it the same way he had handled every other significant obstacle across his entire adult life, through calculated, direct violence against the men who happened to be standing in his way. And the specific killing that actually made him boss deserves careful attention here, because it establishes precisely the same pattern that would eventually be turned back against him only a few years later by men who had learned this exact lesson by watching him apply it firsthand. Understanding this earlier killing matters considerably for grasping everything that follows, since it demonstrates that Anastasia's own eventual downfall was never some unprecedented betrayal visited upon an innocent man. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, the same method he had already perfected and used successfully against someone else, finally returning to claim its own architect, once the specific circumstances aligned against him instead. Through the 1930s and into the 1940s, Anastasia had served under a boss named Vincent Mangano, who led the organization that would eventually become known as the Gambino crime family, alongside his own brother Philip. The Mangano brothers had built their own considerable standing within New York's underworld across years of careful, patient work, and Vincent Mangano in particular carried himself with the kind of formal authority expected of a boss who had earned his position through legitimate internal advancement rather than through any single dramatic act of violence. The relationship between Anastasia and the Mangano brothers had never been especially warm, and it deteriorated considerably as Anastasia's own influence grew, particularly through his deepening alliances with Charles Luciano and Frank Costello, relationships Mangano viewed with genuine, escalating suspicion, believing correctly that Anastasia's loyalty had begun running considerably closer to figures outside his own organization than to Mangano himself. This tension simmered for years without erupting into open conflict, the kind of unresolved resentment this account has already traced building slowly within other organizations, before eventually reaching a breaking point that demanded resolution through violence rather than continued patience. Mangano reportedly grew increasingly vocal about his own suspicions regarding Anastasia's true loyalties as the years passed, and associates who worked closely with both men during this period later described an atmosphere within the organization that had grown genuinely tense. Soldiers and capos, aware that some kind of reckoning between their boss and his own increasingly independent, increasingly powerful subordinate, seemed to be building toward an inevitable confrontation, even if nobody could say with any certainty exactly when or how that confrontation would actually arrive. In April 1951, Philip Mangano was found shot to death in a marsh in Brooklyn. His brother Vincent, the family's actual boss, disappeared entirely and was never found, presumed murdered under circumstances that were never officially resolved. The disappearance of a sitting boss without any body ever being recovered represented, even within a world already accustomed to violence on a scale this account has traced repeatedly across other organizations, a genuinely unusual and unsettling outcome, denying not only law enforcement, but Mangano's own family and associates any final, certain confirmation of what had actually happened to him. This particular method, ensuring a victim's body would never surface to provide investigators with physical evidence, connects directly back to techniques this broader history has already traced other organizations perfecting across entirely separate decades and entirely separate criminal cultures, a shared, grim understanding across this world that a missing body created considerably less legal exposure than a body investigators could actually examine. When Anastasia appeared before the commission shortly afterward to address the obvious question of what had happened to his own boss, he offered an account that managed to imply the Mangano brothers had been planning to kill him first, without actually admitting any direct role in their disappearance and death himself. This particular framing deserves attention on its own terms, because it illustrates exactly the kind of careful, self-serving narrative construction this account has already traced Anastasia deploying throughout his entire adult life, going back to his own teenage escape from a death sentence through witnesses who conveniently changed their testimony. He never confessed. He never denied outright either. He simply offered a version of events plausible enough that the men judging him could choose to accept it without requiring themselves to formally confront the far more likely truth sitting directly beneath his careful phrasing. The commission, whether from genuine uncertainty about what had actually happened, or from simple practical recognition that Anastasia now controlled the organization, regardless of what any formal inquiry concluded, accepted this explanation and formally recognized him as the new boss. The organization was renamed after him, becoming the Anastasia crime family for the remainder of his tenure at its head, a title that would only later revert to the Gambino name once his own successor took control. This acceptance itself reveals something important about how this specific governing structure actually functioned in practice, prioritizing continued stability and practical acknowledgement of existing power over any genuine commitment to formally investigating or punishing violence carried out against even a sitting boss, provided the resulting outcome did not threaten to destabilize the broader arrangement everyone else depended on. This origin story matters enormously for understanding everything that followed, because it establishes with genuine clarity that Anastasia's own claim to leadership rested on precisely the same foundation this account has already traced, destroying other bosses across different organizations and different decades. The willingness of an ambitious subordinate to remove his own superior, through violence, and then construct whatever explanation proved most convenient for the commission's own formal acceptance afterward. Anastasia had not waited patiently for a natural succession or earned his position through some demonstrated record of careful, prudent leadership. He had simply killed the men above him and taken their place, understanding correctly that the wider governing structure would accept the outcome so long as it did not threaten the broader stability everyone else depended on. Once established as boss, Anastasia allied himself closely with Frank Costello, who had emerged as the most powerful and most broadly respected figure sitting atop the commission following Luciano's own deportation back to Italy years earlier. This alliance provided Anastasia with genuine protection and genuine standing within the underworld's highest circles, a partnership built on mutual advantage that would remain stable for years. right up until the specific sequence of events this section is building toward, finally tore it apart. Costello valued Anastasia's willingness to use violence decisively whenever circumstances required it, while Anastasia benefited enormously from Costello's own considerable diplomatic skill and broad respect among the other family bosses, a partnership that combined exactly the two qualities each man individually lacked in sufficient measure. The first serious crack in Anastasia's own position emerged through a dispute involving Meyer Lansky, the financial mastermind who had spent years building an enormously lucrative gambling operation in Havana, Cuba, alongside Luciano's broader interests in the region. Lansky had cultivated these Cuban relationships with considerable patience, working closely with the island's own political establishment to secure the kind of protection and access that made the casino operations there so consistently profitable across multiple years of careful development. Anastasia, always alert to profitable opportunity and never particularly inclined toward the kind of patient relationship building that Lansky's own success depended upon, attempted to muscle his own way into a share of this Cuban casino business. And Lansky, who had built these specific relationships and this specific infrastructure through years of careful, patient work, refused to allow it. When Anastasia responded by attempting to establish his own competing casino operation in Cuba, rather than simply accepting Lansky's refusal, he transformed a manageable business disagreement into a genuine, lasting grievance, pushing Lansky decisively toward whichever rival eventually offered the clearest path toward removing Anastasia from a position where he could continue causing this kind of trouble. This detail matters considerably because it demonstrates that even among his own closest allies and longtime associates, Anastasia's own aggressive, impatient approach to expanding his interests had begun generating exactly the kind of resentment that would eventually prove fatal. A pattern of overreach this broader history of organized crime has already traced, destroying other figures who similarly failed to recognize when their own ambition had begun costing them support they could not actually afford to lose. That rival arrived in the person of Vito Genovese, a man who had spent years nursing his own considerable ambition to become the single most powerful boss in the entire city, an ambition this broader account has already traced, producing devastating consequences across other chapters of organized crime history, entirely separate from Anastasia's own specific story. Genovese recognized in Lansky's growing frustration exactly the kind of opening he needed, and he began building a coalition specifically aimed at removing both Costello and Anastasia together, understanding correctly that Costello's own continued power depended substantially on Anastasia's willingness to serve as his most reliable and most dangerous ally. Genovese's coalition building extended directly into Anastasia's own organization, and this is where the story takes its most genuinely devastating turn. Carlo Gambino, serving as Anastasia's own underboss, and therefore occupying exactly the position of intimate trust this broader history has already traced, proving fatal for boss after boss across other organizations entirely, was persuaded to quietly switch his allegiance to Genovese's side, reportedly promised the position of boss himself once Anastasia had actually been removed. Gambino's own particular temperament made him an especially effective conspirator for exactly this kind of patient, quiet betrayal, a man known throughout his career for careful, understated calculation rather than any visible display of ambition, allowing him to continue serving Anastasia with every outward appearance of loyalty, while the actual groundwork for his removal was already being laid entirely without Anastasia's own knowledge. Genovese also found additional ammunition to use against Anastasia through a separate, entirely internal grievance that had nothing directly to do with the broader Costello conflict. Frank Scalise, who had risen to serve as Anastasia's own underboss at various points and remained a significant figure within his organization, had reportedly been selling formal membership within the family to outside buyers for $50,000 per position, a flagrant, serious violation of Cosa Nostra's own internal rules governing how membership was supposed to be earned, rather than simply purchased by whoever happened to have sufficient money available. This scheme threatened the entire organization's internal integrity, since men who had purchased their way into formal membership carried none of the demonstrated loyalty or criminal competence the induction process was supposed to guarantee, and Genovese used this scandal skillfully, presenting it to the wider commission as further evidence that Anastasia's own leadership had grown dangerously unstable and dangerously permissive. According to testimony Joseph Valachi later provided regarding this specific period, Anastasia actually approved Scalis's own killing once the scheme became impossible to ignore, a detail that illustrates the genuinely brutal, transactional logic governing even Anastasia's own internal discipline. Scalis was killed in June 1957, and when his brother Joseph reportedly threatened retaliation to avenge him, Anastasia offered a temporary reconciliation before ultimately having Joseph killed as well, eliminating both brothers within a relatively short span, once the underlying threat they represented had been fully assessed. This sequence of killings, rather than restoring stability to Anastasia's own organization, instead provided Genovese with exactly the kind of additional evidence he needed to portray Anastasia as an increasingly erratic, dangerously unpredictable figure whose continued leadership threatened everyone connected to him. On May 2, 1957, Genovese moved directly against Costello, arranging for a gunman named Vincent Gigante to shoot him in the lobby of his own Manhattan apartment building. The wound proved only superficial, but it accomplished exactly what Genovese needed regardless, convincing Costello that the risk of continuing to fight for his own position had grown too dangerous to sustain. Costello formally retired, ceding control of his organization to Genovese without further resistance, a decision this account has already examined in earlier work covering Costello's own specific story from a different angle. This left Anastasia standing alone, as the single most significant remaining obstacle between Genovese and the kind of total, uncontested dominance over New York's underworld he had spent years pursuing. Joseph Bonanno later claimed credit for arranging a meeting specifically intended to prevent Anastasia from immediately declaring open war against Genovese, in retaliation for what had happened to Costello, and for a period of roughly 5 months following the shooting, an uneasy, fragile peace held across the underworld, with assurances reportedly extended from the wider 5 families that no further bloodshed would follow. Anastasia, despite his own considerable rage at what had happened to his closest ally, apparently accepted these assurances, a decision that would prove to be the single most consequential misjudgment of his entire life. He had spent decades teaching every other ambitious man in this world exactly how quickly a supposed peace could dissolve into sudden, decisive violence once the right combination of motive and opportunity presented itself. He seems to have never fully applied that same lesson to his own increasingly precarious position, trusting in assurances offered by men who had already, in the specific case of his own underboss Gambino, quietly agreed to help end his life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section follows him into a Manhattan barbershop on an ordinary October morning, unaware that the meeting meant to secure his safety had guaranteed exactly the opposite. Section 6. 5 Shots in a Barber's Chair. The morning of October 25, 1957, began for Albert Anastasia exactly as countless other mornings had begun across the preceding years, an ordinary routine, carried out with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from decades of successfully evading every serious consequence the law and his own criminal world had ever attempted to impose on him. He had survived a death sentence at 19. He had survived decades of murder investigations that consistently collapsed before reaching trial. He had built and led one of the most feared killing operations in the entire history of American organized crime, and he had subsequently killed his own way into control of an entire crime family, eliminating one boss through disappearance and 2 more through direct assassination once their continued survival threatened his own interests. By every measure available to a man who had spent his entire adult life calculating exactly how far violence could carry him, Anastasia had reason to believe he remained, at 55 years old, essentially untouchable. He arrived that morning at the barber shop located inside the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, a business he had reportedly co-owned or held some financial interest in, accompanied by his own godson and protege, a young man named Vincent Squillante. This detail matters for understanding exactly how little Anastasia himself appeared to sense any genuine danger in this specific outing. A man who had spent years teaching an entire criminal world exactly how vulnerable even the most powerful figure became once his guard finally dropped, had chosen, on this particular morning, to bring along someone he considered close enough to treat almost as family, sharing what should have been an entirely ordinary, unremarkable errand, rather than treating the visit with any of the caution that his own life's work should have taught him to apply reflexively to every public appearance, particularly during a period when he understood, at least in the abstract, that his own position within the underworld's shifting balance of power had grown genuinely precarious. Accounts of the barbershop's specific layout describe a space with 10 chairs arranged along a wall of mirrors, a bustling, ordinary business serving a steady stream of customers throughout each business day, the kind of public, visible location that made it simultaneously convenient and, in hindsight, almost recklessly exposed for a man whose enemies had already demonstrated a documented willingness to strike wherever opportunity presented itself. Anastasia settled into one of the barber chairs and requested a shave, an act of almost complete physical vulnerability, reclined, eyes frequently closed against the hot towels a barber typically applies, before beginning the actual work of shaving a customer's face, a position that left him unable to observe his own surroundings, with anything approaching the vigilance a man in his position might have reasonably chosen to maintain. At approximately 10:15 in the morning, two men entered the barber shop wearing scarves, pulled up over the lower portions of their faces, walking directly toward the chair where Anastasia sat reclined and vulnerable. According to the most widely accepted accounts of what happened next, the barber attending to Anastasia stepped back and moved toward a supply closet the moment the two masked men entered, a detail that has fueled considerable speculation over the decades since regarding whether the barber himself had received some advance warning about what was coming, and had simply positioned himself to avoid becoming collateral damage in an assassination he understood was imminent. The two gunmen opened fire almost immediately, striking Anastasia with what most accounts describe as 5 separate shots, though the precise number varies slightly depending on which specific account a person consults. According to a detail that has become one of the most frequently repeated and most darkly ironic elements of this entire story, Anastasia reportedly lunged toward his attackers in the chaotic, disoriented moments after the shooting began, but rather than confronting the actual men firing at him, he mistakenly attacked their reflections in the wall of mirrors surrounding the barber chairs, a final, almost surreal detail that speaks to the genuine confusion and disorientation of a man, caught entirely unprepared, in the specific moment his entire life's pattern of violence finally turned back against him, with total, decisive finality. He collapsed to the floor of the barbershop and died at the scene, never rising from the position his own attacker's bullets had put him in. Squillante, the young protege who had accompanied Anastasia that morning, survived the shooting entirely unharmed, a detail that some historians examining the case have suggested points toward advanced knowledge on his own part regarding what was actually about to happen, though this theory, like so much else connected to Anastasia's death, has never been definitively proven through any formal investigation or subsequent testimony. The two gunmen themselves fled the scene immediately after the shooting, and were never definitively identified or apprehended by police, continuing the exact pattern this account has already traced, defining almost every previous murder investigation connected to Anastasia across his entire adult life. A killing carried out with enough planning and enough professional discipline that the actual triggermen simply vanished into the city's crowded streets, leaving investigators with strong suspicions but no prosecutable evidence. Speculation regarding the specific identity of the shooters has persisted for decades since the killing actually occurred, with various names circulating through both journalistic accounts and later organized crime testimony. Some accounts have suggested involvement from members connected to the Profaci crime family, while others have pointed toward Joseph Gallo and his own brothers, associates of the Profaci organization, who reportedly enjoyed a certain notoriety within the underworld for their willingness to take on exactly this kind of high-profile, high-risk assignment. No formal charges were ever brought against any specific individual for carrying out the actual shooting, and the case has remained officially unsolved in the entire decade since Anastasia's death. One final, fitting irony, given how thoroughly his own career had been built on demonstrating exactly how effectively organized crime could defeat the ordinary machinery of criminal prosecution. The identity of the men who actually ordered the killing carries considerably less genuine ambiguity than the identity of the specific triggermen, even without any formal legal conviction ever having been secured against the individuals most historians and law enforcement officials believe were actually responsible. Vito Genovese, having already engineered Costello's own forced retirement months earlier through the shooting that left him only superficially wounded, needed Anastasia removed entirely to complete his own consolidation of power across New York's underworld. Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's own underboss, had already agreed to switch his loyalty to Genovese's side in exchange for the promise that he himself would inherit control of the organization once Anastasia had been eliminated, A betrayal this account has already traced, developing quietly across the preceding months, while Anastasia himself remained apparently unaware of exactly how completely his own most trusted subordinate had already turned against him. Meyer Lansky's own approval and cooperation mattered considerably as well, given his continued influence over Luciano's broader interests even while Luciano himself remained in exile following his deportation years earlier. And Lansky's own grievance regarding Anastasia's attempted intrusion into the Cuban casino business had already pushed him decisively toward supporting whatever coalition eventually formed to remove Anastasia from a position where he could continue causing this kind of trouble. The combination of these specific interests, Genovese's raw ambition, Gambino's patient, calculated betrayal from within Anastasia's own organization, and Lansky's accumulated business grievance, created exactly the kind of coordinated, multi-party conspiracy this broader history of organized crime has already traced destroying other powerful figures across entirely different organizations and entirely different decades, a pattern where no single grievance alone typically proves sufficient to justify killing a sitting boss, but where several genuine, serious grievances, converging simultaneously, created a coalition capable of overcoming whatever protection that boss's own reputation and demonstrated capacity for retaliation might otherwise have provided him. What makes Anastasia's own specific death worth examining, alongside the broader pattern this account has traced across its entire history of his life, is the sheer, almost poetic symmetry embedded in exactly how it occurred. This was a man whose own rise to power had been built directly on the calculated removal of Vincent and Philip Mangano, a killing carried out with enough careful planning that no body was ever recovered and no formal responsibility was ever definitively established. He died through almost exactly the same method he had once applied against them, a coordinated conspiracy involving his own trusted subordinate, executed with sufficient professional discipline that the actual gunman escaped identification and prosecution entirely, leaving behind only the same kind of persistent, widely accepted, but never formally proven understanding of who had actually been responsible that had defined virtually every previous murder connected to his name across his entire adult life. The specific setting of the killing, a public barbershop rather than some isolated private location, also deserves attention, because it illustrates something particular about the message this specific act of violence was apparently intended to convey. This account has already traced, across its examination of the Sicilian Mafia's own history in entirely separate work, how killings carried out in visible, public settings frequently served a deliberate communicative function beyond simply eliminating the specific individual targeted, announcing to the wider underworld, watching from a careful distance, exactly how completely a particular figure's power had actually collapsed once his enemies finally decided to move against him. Anastasia's death, carried out in broad daylight in a public business inside one of Manhattan's most recognizable hotels, delivered exactly this kind of unmistakable message to every other ambitious figure within New York's organized crime landscape, that the man once known as the Lord High Executioner, the figure whose own name had become synonymous with an almost supernatural ability to escape consequence for decades of murder, had finally proven just as vulnerable and just as mortal as every other man he himself had once ordered killed. News of Anastasia's death spread quickly through both the criminal underworld and the wider public, generating the kind of intense media coverage that his own earlier career, however violent and however widely suspected of extensive murder, had somehow generally managed to avoid attracting on anything approaching this scale. The specific image of the Lord High Executioner gunned down in a barber's chair, still wrapped in the hot towels applied moments before his own death, captured something the press found genuinely irresistible, a dramatic, almost theatrically fitting conclusion for a man whose entire career had been built on exactly the kind of sudden, brutal violence he had now finally experienced firsthand, rather than simply ordering against others from a careful, insulated distance. Within the underworld itself, the killing produced significant, immediate consequences that extended considerably beyond simply removing one powerful figure from the board. Carlo Gambino assumed formal control of Anastasia's former organization almost immediately, exactly as Genovese had reportedly promised him in exchange for his own quiet cooperation in the conspiracy. The organization, which had briefly carried Anastasia's own name during his tenure at its head, was renamed once again, becoming from this point forward the Gambino crime family, a name that would remain attached to this specific organization for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond, carried forward eventually into the era of John Gotti, and the considerably later chapters of organized crime history, this broader account has already examined an entirely separate work, covering different figures and different decades. Genovese, having successfully engineered the removal of both Costello and Anastasia within the same calendar year, appeared to have finally achieved exactly the kind of total, uncontested dominance over New York's underworld he had spent years working toward. This apparent triumph, however, proved considerably less durable than Genovese himself likely anticipated in the immediate aftermath of Anastasia's assassination. Only weeks after the barbershop killing, Genovese convened a massive gathering of organized crime figures from across the entire country at a rural estate in Appalachian, New York, apparently intending to formalize and celebrate his own new position of supreme authority in front of an assembled audience of his own peers. State troopers, growing suspicious of the unusual volume of traffic converging on this specific rural property, raided the gathering instead, catching dozens of major organized crime figures together on record for the first time in American history. A genuinely catastrophic public relations disaster that drew exactly the kind of sustained, intensive law enforcement attention onto the entire underworld that men like Anastasia had spent their entire careers working to avoid. This disaster, arriving so soon after Genovese's own carefully engineered triumph, created precisely the opening his own remaining rivals needed to move against him in turn. This account has already examined, in entirely separate work covering an earlier chapter of this broader history, how Genovese's former allies, including Luciano, Costello, Gambino, and Lansky, eventually orchestrated a coordinated narcotics conspiracy specifically designed to remove him from power without triggering the kind of open violence that had already drawn so much unwanted attention onto the underworld following Anastasia's killing and the subsequent Appalachian debacle. Genovese was convicted in 1959 based substantially on testimony from a bribed drug dealer and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, where he would remain until his own death in 1969, having spent the final decade of his life locked away, undone by exactly the kind of coordinated, patient betrayal from his own former allies that he himself had once orchestrated against Anastasia only 2 years earlier. This final, cascading sequence of consequences deserves particular attention as this account approaches its own closing sections, because it illustrates something this broader history of organized crime has traced repeatedly across entirely different organizations and entirely different decades. The specific, almost mechanical consistency with which the exact methods a man uses to seize power eventually return to claim him in turn, once his own accumulated enemies find sufficient reason and sufficient opportunity to apply that same method against him. Anastasia killed his way to power over the Mangano organization and died through almost precisely the same combination of patient conspiracy and decisive violence he himself had once employed. Genovese engineered Anastasia's own removal and found himself, within only 2 years, undone by a coalition of the very allies who had helped him accomplish it, betrayed in turn by men who had watched him demonstrate exactly how completely a sufficiently motivated coalition could remove even the most powerful figure once his continued survival had become more costly than his removal. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section follows Carlo Gambino, the underboss whose quiet, patient betrayal made all of it possible, into the decades of power his silence ultimately purchased. Section 7. The quiet man who inherited everything. Carlo Gambino stepped into the position Albert Anastasia's death had created for him, with none of the visible fanfare or dramatic assertion of authority that had characterized his predecessor's own approach to power across the entirety of his violent career. Where Anastasia had ruled through open, unmistakable fear, a reputation built on decades of documented murder, and an explosive, hair-trigger temper that made every associate around him understand exactly what awaited anyone foolish enough to cross him, Gambino governed through an almost entirely opposite temperament, careful, understated, and so consistently unassuming in his own public presentation that even seasoned law enforcement officials, who understood exactly how much power he actually commanded, frequently struggled to reconcile that reality with the quiet, almost grandfatherly figure they encountered whenever they actually crossed paths with him. This contrast in style deserves careful examination, because it illustrates something important about exactly what kind of man had been patient enough to wait years inside Anastasia's own organization, serving faithfully as underboss, while quietly building the specific relationships and specific opportunities that would eventually allow him to betray his own boss at precisely the moment that betrayal offered the greatest possible reward. Gambino had spent years positioned directly beside Anastasia, privy to exactly the kind of intimate operational knowledge this broader account has already traced, proving fatal for boss after boss across other criminal organizations examined in entirely separate work. Understanding Anastasia's routines, his relationships, his specific vulnerabilities, and the exact points of leverage that Vito Genovese would eventually need to exploit in order to remove him successfully. What makes Gambino's own specific role in this conspiracy worth setting apart from other comparable betrayals examined across this broader history of organized crime is the sheer duration and sheer patience the entire arrangement required. This was not a soldier flipping impulsively under sudden pressure, or a rival striking during some brief, unplanned moment of vulnerability. Gambino had reportedly agreed to switch his allegiance toward Genovese's coalition well in advance of Anastasia's actual killing, understanding clearly and calmly that his own reward for this cooperation would be nothing less than complete control over the very organization he was helping to decapitate. This required him to continue serving Anastasia with every outward appearance of genuine loyalty across the months the actual conspiracy took to develop, maintaining the kind of careful, disciplined patience that few men within this specific criminal culture ever demonstrated with comparable consistency. Once installed as boss following Anastasia's death in the barbershop, Gambino set about consolidating and expanding his own new organization with a methodical, business-like approach that stood in sharp, deliberate contrast against the flamboyant, headline-generating style that had defined Anastasia's entire tenure. Gambino avoided, wherever possible, exactly the kind of visible, public violence that had made his predecessor simultaneously so feared and so vulnerable to sustained law enforcement attention. He preferred quiet negotiation, careful business arrangements, and a general operational philosophy that prioritized long-term stability and profitability over the kind of dramatic, immediate displays of dominance that Anastasia had relied upon throughout his entire career. This approach proved remarkably successful across the following 2 decades. Gambino built his own organization into what many historians and law enforcement officials examining this period would eventually come to regard as the single most powerful and most profitable of New York's 5 families, expanding into construction, garment industry racketeering, labor union control, and a wide range of additional criminal enterprises, all managed with a level of discipline and careful, patient planning that Anastasia's own more volatile, more visible approach to leadership had never been able to sustain over any comparable stretch of time. Gambino understood, in a way his predecessor apparently never fully internalized despite decades of first-hand experience navigating this exact world, that genuine, lasting power within organized crime depended considerably more on careful discretion and sustained profitability than on the kind of dramatic, headline-generating violence that inevitably drew unwanted attention from the very authorities every criminal organization needed to avoid provoking unnecessarily. Gambino's own personal style reflected this broader philosophy in ways that made him almost the inverse image of everything Anastasia had represented. He lived modestly by comparison to many of his own peers, avoided ostentatious public displays of wealth, and cultivated a public persona so unassuming that journalists who profiled him during this period frequently commented on how genuinely difficult it was to reconcile his quiet, soft-spoken demeanor with the extraordinary criminal power he actually commanded behind the scenes. This deliberate cultivation of an unremarkable public image served Gambino extraordinarily well throughout his tenure, allowing him to operate for years with considerably less sustained law enforcement pressure than a more visible, more flamboyant boss might have attracted through simple, unavoidable force of personality. The specific irony embedded in Gambino's own subsequent success deserves particular attention here, set against everything this broader account has already traced regarding exactly how he actually rose to power in the first place. A man whose entire path to leadership had been built on patient, calculated betrayal of the boss who had trusted him most intimately, went on to build a reputation, across the following 2 decades, as one of the most stable, most successful, and in certain respects, most genuinely respected bosses in the entire history of the American Mafia. This particular trajectory illustrates something this broader history of organized crime has already traced repeatedly across other organizations examined in entirely separate work. The way in which the specific act of betrayal that elevates a man to power frequently disappears entirely from how that man's subsequent leadership comes to be remembered and evaluated, judged instead almost exclusively on the basis of how effectively he manages to wield the power his own betrayal originally secured for him. Gambino's own family life during this period further reinforced the careful, deliberately unremarkable public image he had cultivated. He had married Vincenza Castellano in 1926, and this marriage connected him by blood and by extended family relationships to figures who would prove significant across the subsequent history of his own organization, including Paul Castellano, whose own eventual rise to lead the Gambino family following Carlo's own death. This account has already examined in earlier work covering an entirely different chapter of this broader history. Gambino settled in Massapequa, Long Island, choosing a quiet, suburban existence considerably removed from the more visible, more urban patterns of residence that many other significant organized crime figures of this era preferred. A choice that reinforced, at every level of his daily life, the same careful, deliberate avoidance of unnecessary attention that defined his entire approach to leadership. Federal and state law enforcement officials understood, throughout the entirety of Gambino's tenure as boss, exactly how much power he genuinely commanded, and multiple investigations and prosecutions were attempted against him across the years, targeting various aspects of his organization's criminal enterprises. Gambino's own particular skill, however, lay precisely in his ability to insulate himself from the kind of direct, prosecutable evidence that had eventually managed to convict figures like Vito Genovese, maintaining sufficient distance from the actual operational details of specific crimes that prosecutors repeatedly found themselves unable to construct cases capable of surviving contact with an actual trial. This pattern echoes, in a considerably more restrained and more carefully managed form, the exact same vulnerability this broader account has already traced defining Anastasia's own decades-long evasion of serious legal consequence, though Gambino achieved this insulation through patient discretion rather than through the kind of active witness intimidation and elimination that had characterized his predecessor's approach to the identical problem. What makes Gambino's own specific legacy worth examining alongside Anastasia's story, rather than treating it as simply an interesting footnote following the more dramatic events this account has already traced, is the genuine, uncomfortable question it raises about how history actually chooses to remember men who achieve power through betrayal versus men who achieve it through open, visible violence. Anastasia, whatever else might be said about his own genuinely monstrous record of documented murder, at least operated with a certain brutal consistency that made his own methods and his own character relatively easy to categorize and condemn without much ambiguity. Gambino's own path to power required a fundamentally different kind of moral calculation, years of patient, deliberate deception directed against a man who trusted him intimately, followed by decades of genuinely successful, genuinely stable leadership that many contemporary accounts from this period actually praised in terms considerably more favorable than anything ever written about the man he had helped remove. Gambino continued leading his own organization until his death from natural causes in October 1976, passing away peacefully at his own home, surrounded by family, an ending that stands in genuinely striking contrast against the violent, sudden deaths this broader account has traced, claiming so many other significant figures across this entire history of organized crime. This particular detail deserves emphasis precisely because of how thoroughly it inverts the pattern this account has established across its preceding sections. Anastasia, who killed his way to power and ruled through open, visible terror, died suddenly and violently in a public barbershop, cut down by the same kind of coordinated conspiracy he himself had once employed against his own predecessors. Gambino, who achieved power through patient, quiet betrayal and ruled through careful, understated discretion, lived a long life and died peacefully, having successfully avoided both the kind of prosecution that claimed Genovese and the kind of violent retribution that claimed Anastasia himself. This inversion illustrates something worth sitting with directly, a genuinely uncomfortable lesson this broader history of organized crime keeps returning to across its examination of multiple different organizations spanning multiple different decades. The specific method by which a man seizes power within this world, whether through open violence or through patient, quiet betrayal, appears to matter considerably less for his own long-term survival and success than the specific temperament and specific discipline he subsequently applies to actually exercising that power once he has secured it. Anastasia's own explosive volatility, the very quality that had made him so effective and so feared as an enforcer across decades of documented violence, ultimately proved to be exactly the quality that made his own eventual removal not merely possible, but, in the eyes of his own former allies, genuinely necessary. Gambino's own careful, patient discretion, the very quality that had allowed him to betray his own boss so effectively in the first place, proved equally effective at protecting his own subsequent decades of leadership from the kind of internal rebellion or external prosecution that claimed so many other figures examined across this broader history. Before his own death, Gambino reportedly moved to install Paul Castellano as his chosen successor, rather than the man many soldiers within the organization actually expected to inherit the position, a decision that would eventually produce exactly the kind of internal resentment and instability this broader account has already examined in considerable detail, in entirely separate work, covering Castellano's own subsequent downfall decades later. This final act of succession planning connects Gambino's own story directly forward into the considerably later chapters of Gambino family history this broader account has already traced in earlier work: John Gotti's own rise, the Castellano assassination, and the eventual downfall of the organization through Sammy Gravano's historic cooperation with federal authorities. Every one of these later chapters traces its own origins, in one way or another, back to the specific chain of betrayal this account has now traced across its full examination of Anastasia's own life and death, a chain that began with Anastasia's own killing of the Mangano brothers, continued through Gambino's own patient betrayal of Anastasia himself, and would eventually culminate, decades later, in an organization whose entire leadership history reads as an almost unbroken sequence of trusted subordinates removing the very bosses who had elevated them, each one convinced their own particular betrayal represented a justified, necessary correction, rather than simply the latest iteration of exactly the same pattern that had defined this specific criminal family since the earliest days of its founding. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section of this account draws together everything this history has traced and asks what Anastasia's entire life actually reveals about the world the films never got right. Section 8. What the executioner actually built. Albert Anastasia's life resists the kind of clean, contained moral shape audiences generally expect from stories about organized crime, and understanding exactly why requires returning to the earliest moment this account examined. A 15-year-old boy, walking off a freighter in Brooklyn, with nothing but the clothes on his back, and whatever hardness the years aboard that ship had already carved into him. That boy became, within a matter of years, a convicted murderer sentenced to death, and the specific mechanism through which he escaped that sentence, witnesses recanting or simply disappearing before they could ever testify against him, established a pattern he would repeat with mechanical, almost bureaucratic consistency across the following 3.5 decades of his adult life. There is something worth pausing on in how completely this single early event functioned as a template for everything that followed. A 19-year-old learning, through nothing more than luck and intimidation, that the American legal system's confidence in its own machinery rested on a foundation considerably more fragile than anyone administering that system wanted to admit. This early lesson deserves to be examined not merely as a biographical detail, but as the genuine intellectual foundation underlying everything Anastasia subsequently built. Most young men who escape a death sentence through fortunate circumstance might reasonably be expected to treat the experience as a warning, a signal that continued criminal activity carried genuine, mortal risk that had simply failed to materialize this particular time through no real credit of their own. Anastasia drew the opposite conclusion entirely, and the specificity of that conclusion matters enormously for understanding the rest of his career. He did not learn that he had been lucky. He learned that the system itself could be defeated reliably, systematically, and repeatedly, provided a person understood exactly which specific mechanism made prosecution actually work, and applied sufficient pressure to that mechanism before it ever had the chance to function as designed. This was not luck internalized as luck. This was luck reverse-engineered into a genuine, repeatable methodology, and Anastasia would spend the following 3.5 decades refining and applying that methodology with a consistency that eventually made him one of the most successful criminals, measured purely by his own ability to evade consequence, in the entire history of American organized crime. What makes Anastasia's story worth measuring against the popular, romanticized version of organized crime that films have spent decades presenting to audiences is the sheer, accumulated weight of exactly how many times this same pattern actually repeated itself across his entire career. This was never a single dramatic betrayal or a single moment of unforgivable excess that shattered an otherwise functioning code of honor. This was a man who built an entire professional identity, and eventually an entire industrial operation employing dozens of specialized killers, around the specific insight that American justice depended entirely on witnesses willing to testify and willing to survive long enough to do so, and who spent every subsequent year of his adult life exploiting that exact vulnerability with a thoroughness that eventually made him one of the most feared and most successful criminals in the entire history of the country. Measured against this consistency, the popular cinematic tradition's tendency to frame organized crime around a single defining act of betrayal starts to look less like dramatic simplification and more like a genuine misunderstanding of how this particular kind of criminal career actually accumulates its power over time. One small successful evasion compounding into the next until the entire pattern becomes self-reinforcing. There is a specific structural observation worth making here about exactly why this pattern proved so durable across such an extended stretch of time. Each individual instance of witness intimidation or elimination did not simply resolve a single legal threat in isolation. It reinforced, within the wider criminal underworld and within law enforcement circles alike, a general understanding that pursuing Anastasia through conventional legal channels represented a poor use of resources, since even the strongest cases assembled against him seemed to dissolve reliably once they approached trial. This reputation became, over time, almost as protective as any individual act of intimidation, discouraging prosecutors from even attempting cases that experience suggested would likely collapse, regardless of how much effort went into building them. Anastasia's own survival, in other words, became partially self-sustaining, a reputation for untouchability that discouraged the very efforts that might otherwise have eventually tested that untouchability more rigorously. Consider what Murder Incorporated actually represented, examined now against the full arc this account has traced across its preceding sections. This was not a loose collection of angry men occasionally settling scores when circumstances demanded it. This was a centralized, professionally managed enterprise, contracts distributed according to specific criteria, killers selected for their lack of personal connection to intended targets, weapons disposed of immediately following each job, an operation that conservative estimates place responsible for somewhere above 500 killings across roughly a decade of active operation, with some historians suggesting the true figure may have exceeded 1,000 once every contract carried out across the entire country is properly accounted for. Anastasia sat near the very top of this structure, and the specific discipline he brought to protecting both himself and the broader enterprise from prosecution represented, in its own dark way, a genuine managerial achievement, a demonstration of exactly how thoroughly criminal enterprise could be organized along lines that would have been recognizable to any legitimate business owner managing a specialized workforce, if that workforce happened to specialize exclusively in ending human lives on contract. This particular achievement deserves to be sat with a moment longer than a simple restatement allows, because the specific horror embedded within it is not the violence alone, but the procedural, almost administrative calm with which that violence was organized. Legitimate businesses of the era kept records, managed personnel according to specific skill sets, and settled accounts once a service had been rendered to a client's satisfaction. Murder Incorporated mirrored every one of these ordinary business functions with unsettling precision, the only difference being the specific product this particular enterprise had chosen to deal in. Anastasia's own genius, if that word can be applied to something this monstrous, without seeming to grant it an undeserved dignity, lay in recognizing that the same qualities that made any enterprise successful, discipline, specialization, careful management of risk, applied equally well to an enterprise built entirely around ending human lives for a fee. The individual killers who staffed this operation deserve renewed attention here, not simply as biographical footnotes, but as evidence of exactly how thoroughly Anastasia's own managerial philosophy shaped the men working directly beneath him. Harry Strauss, Abe Reles, Frank Abendondo, and Martin Goldstein each brought distinct methods and distinct reputations to their work, yet all operated within the same basic framework Anastasia had established. Contracts accepted through proper channels, work carried out with professional discipline, and personal grievance kept carefully separate from the business itself, except in those specific instances, examined already through the Schuster killing, where Anastasia's own volatile temperament overrode the careful professionalism he otherwise imposed on the enterprise as a whole. This tension between imposed discipline and personal volatility runs through the entire arc this account has traced. A man who demanded procedural care from everyone beneath him, while reserving for himself the right to abandon that same care whenever his own temper decided the situation warranted it. The killing of Abe Reles deserves particular weight in any final accounting of what Anastasia's life actually reveals, because it illustrates something this broader history of organized crime has traced repeatedly across other criminal cultures examined in entirely separate work. The way even the most careful, most seemingly comprehensive institutional protection the state could construct around a witness proved, in this specific case, entirely insufficient once the interests threatened by that witness's testimony decided his continued survival had become unacceptable. 6 police officers guarded Reles around the clock inside a supposedly secure hotel suite, and he died anyway, hours before testimony that would have connected Anastasia directly to specific murders in a way no prior prosecution had ever managed to achieve. The phrase that emerged from this specific case, "the canary who could sing but couldn't fly," captures something considerably darker than simple gallows humor. It captures a genuine, documented demonstration of exactly how far organized crime's reach actually extended, defeating not merely ordinary witnesses too frightened to testify, but a fully institutionalized, supposedly comprehensive system of police protection specifically designed to prevent exactly this outcome. What deserves further emphasis here is the specific message this particular killing sent well beyond the immediate legal consequences it produced for Anastasia personally. Every future potential informant watching this case unfold, whether they belong to Anastasia's own organization or to any other criminal enterprise operating anywhere in the country, absorbed a lesson considerably more chilling than any direct threat could have delivered. The state's own protective apparatus, however comprehensive it appeared on paper, could not actually guarantee a cooperating witness's survival if the people threatened by that witness's testimony wanted him dead badly enough. This lesson would echo forward through decades of subsequent organized crime history, shaping how cautiously later witnesses approached their own decisions to cooperate, and shaping how aggressively prosecutors eventually needed to reform witness protection protocols in the years following Reles's own death. There is a particular symmetry worth drawing out here between Reles's own death and Anastasia's earliest brush with the American legal system as a 19-year-old facing execution. Both cases involved witnesses whose testimony should have produced decisive, unambiguous legal consequences. Both cases instead produced outcomes shaped entirely by intimidation and elimination, rather than by any genuine adjudication of guilt or innocence. The specific difference, of course, is that Anastasia occupied the position of beneficiary in the first case and the position of primary threat in the second, a reversal that illustrates something this broader account has traced repeatedly: the way this specific world's most effective operators tend to apply identical methods regardless of which side of a given transaction they happen to occupy, treating witness elimination as simply a tool available to whichever party possesses sufficient motive and sufficient capability to employ it. And then there is Arnold Schuster, the detail this account has already examined that separates Anastasia's own specific character from almost every other organized crime figure this broader history has traced across its extensive examination of different criminal cultures and different decades. Popular imagination surrounding organized crime consistently assumes some rough, unwritten boundary protecting ordinary civilians who have no direct connection to the criminal underworld, a limit that even men fully capable of extreme violence within their own professional context generally chose to respect, understanding that killing innocent, uninvolved people invited exactly the kind of sustained public and law enforcement attention that made continued criminal operation considerably more difficult for everyone connected to the underworld. Anastasia ordered the death of a 24-year-old clothing salesman, according to the most widely credited account of the killing's origin, purely out of irritation at watching him discuss his own role in a bank robber's capture on television. Whatever the precise, fully verified motive behind that specific killing, and this account has already acknowledged the genuine uncertainty surrounding Valachi's second-hand testimony regarding it, the underlying willingness to cross this particular line, and to cross it over something this genuinely trivial, illustrates a character considerably darker than anything the more romanticized tradition of organized crime storytelling has ever been willing to depict with comparable honesty. The Schuster killing also deserves examination here for what it reveals about the specific limits of Anastasia's own strategic thinking, a detail worth setting against the genuine managerial sophistication this account has already credited him with demonstrating through his leadership of Murder Incorporated. A man capable of building and sustaining a professionally organized killing enterprise across an entire decade, insulating himself from prosecution through careful, disciplined operational security, proved simultaneously incapable of recognizing that ordering an innocent civilian's death over a television appearance represented exactly the kind of reckless, poorly considered decision his own operational discipline should have prevented. This contradiction, professional care applied inconsistently, present in the enterprise's broader structure, but entirely absent from Anastasia's own personal, temper-driven decision-making, illustrates something this account has already traced as central to understanding his eventual downfall. His own colleagues within the underworld did not turn against him because he was violent. They turned against him because his violence had become unpredictable, divorced from the kind of careful business calculation that had once made him valuable rather than merely dangerous. The specific chain of betrayal this account has traced across Anastasia's rise and fall deserves one final, direct examination here, because it reveals a pattern considerably larger than any single relationship or any single organization. Anastasia rose to power by removing Vincent and Philip Mangano, presenting the commission with an account that implied justification without ever actually admitting guilt. He died through almost exactly the same mechanism applied against him in turn, a patient, coordinated conspiracy involving his own trusted underboss, executed with sufficient professional discipline that the actual triggermen escaped identification entirely. Carlo Gambino, having betrayed the man who trusted him most intimately, went on to build 2 decades of genuinely successful, genuinely respected leadership, dying peacefully in his own home, while Anastasia himself lay in a mirror-lined barbershop, cut down mid-shave. This chain extends even further than the immediate transfer of power from Anastasia to Gambino, reaching forward through Aniello Della Croce's own direct inheritance of Anastasia's specific methods, and eventually into John Gotti's own catastrophic tenure as boss. A tenure this broader account has already traced in considerable detail through entirely separate work examining the Gambino family's later history. The specific irony embedded in this extended chain deserves emphasis here, as this account approaches its own conclusion. Gambino spent decades deliberately building an organization designed to avoid exactly the kind of visible, headline-generating violence Anastasia had once represented. That same organization, through Della Croce's own mentorship of the young Gotti, eventually produced a boss who returned the entire family directly back to Anastasia's own original template: open violence, public assassination, and a level of visibility that drew exactly the kind of sustained federal attention Gambino had spent his entire career successfully avoiding. This is, ultimately, why the story this account has traced across these sections deserves to be measured directly against the far more sentimental, far more romanticized version of organized crime loyalty and honor that popular film has spent decades presenting to audiences. The Godfather, and the wider tradition of storytelling it inspired, offers viewers a world built around family loyalty, careful codes of conduct, and violence deployed only reluctantly, as a last resort against genuine threats, rather than as a casual, almost recreational response to minor personal irritation. That film's own most memorable moments derive their power precisely from the tension between the Corleone family's stated values and the violence they actually commit, a tension the narrative treats as genuinely tragic, a family forced by circumstance into choices that violate whatever better nature they might otherwise have possessed. Nothing in Anastasia's actual documented life offers this same tension, because nothing in his actual documented life suggests any better nature straining against the violence he chose to commit. He killed a fellow dock worker at 19, over competition for jobs, and escaped a death sentence through witness intimidation. He helped assassinate Giuseppe Masseria to secure his own position within a newly forming criminal order, then built an industrial killing operation that treated murder as an ordinary commercial transaction, contracts fulfilled, and payment collected with the same procedural detachment a legitimate business might apply to any other service. He killed his own boss, or arranged for his disappearance in a manner that left no body for investigators to examine, to seize control of an organization for himself. He ordered the death of an innocent civilian over wounded pride at seeing himself indirectly criticized on a television broadcast. And when the specific machinery of betrayal he himself had perfected across decades of practice finally turned back against him, orchestrated by his own trusted underboss working in coalition with men whose grievances against him had accumulated for years, he died in a barber's chair, wrapped in hot towels, lunging in his own final, disoriented moments, at reflections in a mirror rather than at the actual men who had come to kill him. What remains, examining Anastasia's full trajectory from a poor, fatherless boy in Calabria through decades of documented murder and finally into a public assassination that generated genuine relief across both the criminal underworld and law enforcement circles who had spent decades failing to hold him meaningfully accountable for anything, is a story that offers considerably less romance and considerably more discomfort than anything the popular cinematic tradition surrounding organized crime has ever attempted to depict. There is no clean redemption arc available anywhere within this specific history, no final act of loyalty or sacrifice that might soften the accumulated weight of everything that came before it. There is only a man who discovered, at 19, exactly how far intimidation could carry him, and who spent every subsequent year proving that discovery correct, until the same discovery, applied by other hands against him in turn, finally proved correct one last time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final section of this account follows what his methods actually built once passed into other hands, and what they reveal about the world the films never got right. Section 9. The Boy Who Grew Up Inside His Shadow. John Gotti was still a teenager running errands on the streets of East New York when he first began working for a capo named Carmine Fatico, part of an organization that, at the time, was still widely known throughout the neighborhood as the Anastasia family, carrying the name of a boss who had already been dead for years, but whose reputation continued shaping the culture of the organization Gotti was only beginning to enter. This detail matters enormously for understanding exactly how directly Anastasia's own legacy continued shaping the criminal world this account has traced across its preceding sections, extending its influence forward through an entire generation of younger gangsters who had never actually met the man, but who grew up absorbing stories about him as though he represented something close to a founding legend. A figure whose name still carried genuine weight within the organization, years after his own violent death in the barbershop. This account has already examined in considerable detail. Gotti's own childhood in the years before this apprenticeship began offers useful context for understanding exactly why Anastasia's particular reputation resonated so powerfully with him once he encountered it. Growing up in a large working-class family in the Bronx before his own family eventually relocated to East New York, Gotti had already begun demonstrating the same particular combination of physical toughness and casual disregard for authority that would come to define his entire adult career. By 14, he had moved from ordinary street fighting into burglary and car theft, and an accident at a construction site during one of these early criminal ventures cost him part of a toe, leaving him with the distinctive, slightly bouncing walk that later became one of his more recognizable physical traits among both his own associates and the federal agents who spent years tracking him. This early pattern of physical risk-taking and casual criminality provided exactly the kind of foundation that made him immediately legible to the older men within Fatico's crew, who recognized in the teenage Gotti precisely the raw material this specific criminal culture had always valued most: a willingness to absorb physical risk and inflict violence without excessive hesitation. Gotti's own path into this world ran directly through a man named Agnello Della Croce, who had studied organized crime directly under Anastasia himself decades earlier, following him into the Mangano organization. Before it ever became the Gambino family, this account has already traced through its later chapters. Della Croce absorbed Anastasia's own particular combination of calculated brutality and theatrical menace, reportedly developing a habit of staring directly into a victim's face at the exact moment of death, a mannerism one federal prosecutor later described in terms suggesting something almost ritualistic about the way Della Croce approached violence. Language that echoes directly back to the specific reputation this account has already traced Anastasia himself cultivating decades earlier as a man who seemed to derive genuine, uncomplicated satisfaction from killing, rather than simply tolerating it as a professional necessity. Della Croce's own personal eccentricities extended well beyond this specific inherited approach to violence, and they deserve attention here because they illustrate exactly the kind of theatrical, almost performative menace that had also characterized Anastasia's own public reputation across his entire career. Della Croce reportedly disguised himself as a priest during certain periods of his criminal career, adopting the alias Father O'Neill and greeting police officers on their regular patrol routes with an unsettling cheerfulness that combined genuine, casual contempt for law enforcement with an almost playful willingness to taunt the very officers meant to be investigating him. In one particularly striking documented incident, Della Croce discovered two police officers attempting to record him using hidden recording equipment and reportedly forced them, at gunpoint, to physically eat the recording tape rather than simply confiscating or destroying it through more conventional means. A detail that captures precisely the kind of theatrical, attention-seeking brutality that Anastasia himself had once specialized in, violence performed as much for its own symbolic power as for any practical necessity the specific situation actually required. When young Gotti was assigned to brief Della Croce as part of his own developing responsibilities within Fatico's crew, the two men formed a relationship that would define the entire remaining trajectory of Gotti's own criminal career. Gotti later described Della Croce as a man's man, admiring specifically the toughness and physical intimidation Della Croce projected, qualities Gotti recognized because he shared them himself, and the two men bonded over shared bluntness, shared profanity, and a shared willingness to project menace through physical presence alone. What Gotti received from this relationship extended well beyond simple mentorship in the ordinary criminal sense. Della Croce carried with him direct, first-hand knowledge of exactly how Anastasia had operated decades earlier, and he shared that knowledge freely with the young man who had impressed him, meaning Gotti's own understanding of leadership within this specific criminal culture traced directly back, through only a single intermediary, to the very figure this account has spent its preceding sections examining in exhaustive detail. This mentorship deepened considerably once Gotti's own criminal career began generating genuine results within the organization. Fatico grew impressed enough with Gotti's own ability to collect gambling debts and enforce discipline across East New York's illegal betting operations that he entrusted him with expanded responsibility over the neighborhood's entire gambling apparatus, a promotion that placed Gotti in increasingly direct, regular contact with Della Croce, who by this point had risen to serve as the Gambino family's own underboss beneath Carlo Gambino himself. This arrangement meant that Gotti spent years absorbing lessons directly from a man whose own criminal education traced back to Anastasia's personal tutelage, creating a chain of direct instruction spanning 3 full generations, Anastasia teaching Della Croce teaching Gotti, each transmission carrying forward the specific combination of calculated brutality and theatrical menace that had first made Anastasia himself so feared decades earlier. This lineage deserves particular attention because it complicates any assumption that Anastasia's own specific brand of violence and open intimidation represented some kind of aberration, eventually corrected by more careful, more businesslike successors. Carlo Gambino, this account has already traced, deliberately built his own leadership style around the opposite of everything Anastasia represented: quiet, understated, allergic to unnecessary attention. But Della Croce, operating as underboss beneath Gambino for years, carried forward an entirely different inheritance, Anastasia's own explosive, visible brand of menace, and he passed that inheritance directly to Gotti, the very man who would eventually order Paul Castellano's assassination and inherit control of the organization Gambino had spent decades trying to insulate from exactly this kind of visible, headline-generating violence. Two competing traditions, one careful and hidden, one loud and theatrical, both traced back through this same family's history, and it was ultimately Anastasia's own tradition, carried forward through Della Croce, that produced the boss who would eventually bring the entire organization to its most devastating legal reckoning decades later. The specific timing of Gotti's own eventual rise to power deserves examination here as well, because it illustrates exactly how directly his own path echoed the pattern this account has traced across the entire history of this organization's leadership. When several members of Gotti's own crew were indicted for narcotics trafficking, a violation of Paul Castellano's explicit prohibition against family involvement in drug dealing that this broader account has already examined in earlier work covering Castellano's own downfall, Gotti reportedly feared that Castellano would have him killed for failing to control his own subordinates. This fear, rather than simply prompting a defensive posture, instead drove Gotti toward exactly the same calculated, preemptive violence this account has traced defining Anastasia's own rise decades earlier. Rather than waiting to discover whether Castellano would actually move against him, Gotti struck first, orchestrating the December 1985 assassination outside Sparks Steakhouse that this broader account has examined in considerable detail in entirely separate work. Gotti's own admiration for this specific lineage extended into small, almost superstitious details that surface repeatedly in accounts of his early career. He studied Della Croce's mannerisms carefully, adopting elements of his mentor's own physical bearing and verbal style, and through Della Croce he absorbed stories about Anastasia that shaped his own understanding of what genuine power within this world was supposed to look like: open, visible, and enforced through fear that everyone in the immediate vicinity could recognize and respect without needing any further explanation. This stands in direct, illuminating contrast against everything this account has already traced regarding Carlo Gambino's own successful, decades-long reign, built on precisely the opposite philosophy, and it helps explain why Gotti's own eventual tenure as boss would prove so spectacularly, catastrophically different from Gambino's, a return to exactly the kind of visible, attention-drawing violence that Gambino had spent his entire career trying to avoid, and that Anastasia himself had once treated as an ordinary, unremarkable exercise of authority. There is a particular detail worth dwelling on here regarding exactly how Gotti's own subsequent public persona, the expensive suits, the media attention, the open defiance of federal prosecutors that eventually earned him the nickname the Teflon Don, drew directly from the same theatrical instincts this account has already traced, defining Anastasia's own public reputation decades earlier. Anastasia had never sought quite the same level of sustained media attention that would eventually surround Gotti, operating in an era before television cameras and tabloid photographers had developed the same appetite for organized crime figures that would later define coverage of Gotti's own career. But the underlying instinct, a genuine, almost compulsive need to be recognized and feared rather than simply operating quietly and profitably, connects both men across the decades separating their respective careers, an inherited temperament passed down through Della Croce's own direct mentorship, regardless of how differently the specific historical moment each man occupied, ultimately shaped the public expression of that temperament. The specific fate of Vincent Squillante, the young protege who had accompanied Anastasia into the barber shop on the morning of his assassination and walked away entirely unharmed, deserves careful examination here as well, because the historical record surrounding his own eventual end contains genuine, documented contradiction that this account should present honestly rather than smoothing into false certainty. Squillante had built his own criminal career, partly as an enforcer working directly for Anastasia, earning a reputation within the underworld as something close to royalty within New York's garbage collection racket, a lucrative extortion enterprise built on controlling which companies could operate within the city's waste hauling industry. Some historical accounts describe Squillante as having disappeared entirely in September 1960, his case remaining formally unsolved and his body never recovered, a fate that would echo directly back to the exact method Anastasia himself had once used against Vincent Mangano decades earlier. Other accounts, drawing on different sources examining this same period, describe a considerably more specific and more violent conclusion: a body found with multiple gunshot wounds to the head on a Brooklyn street, years earlier, in the same general period, killed by men who would themselves go on to become significant figures within the broader Gambino organization's subsequent history, including Della Croce himself according to some versions of this account. Whichever specific version of Squillante's fate proves most accurate, and this account has an obligation to acknowledge the genuine uncertainty surrounding it, rather than presenting either account with false confidence, the underlying pattern it illustrates remains consistent regardless. A man who had stood close enough to Anastasia to survive the very assassination that ended his mentor's life did not go on to enjoy a long, peaceful career built on that survival. He met his own violent end within the same broader criminal culture that had already claimed Anastasia himself, a culture this entire account has traced as fundamentally incapable of producing lasting security for anyone who remained within it long enough, regardless of how closely that person had once stood beside genuine power. The specific irony embedded in this detail, that the very man who supposedly enjoyed Della Croce's own direct mentorship, according to some accounts, may have also been the man responsible for eliminating Anastasia's own former protege, illustrates precisely the kind of tangled, self-consuming violence this broader history of organized crime has traced, destroying relationship after relationship across every organization it has examined, loyalty and betrayal operating simultaneously within the same small circle of men who had once trained and fought alongside each other. What makes this specific chapter of the broader Anastasia legacy worth examining, set against everything this account has already established across its preceding sections, is how directly it demonstrates the continued active presence of his particular methods and his particular reputation within an organization that had, on the surface, spent decades trying to move beyond exactly the kind of visible violence he had once represented. Gambino built 2 decades of careful, successful leadership specifically by avoiding Anastasia's own approach to power. Della Croce, operating as his own underboss throughout much of this same period, carried Anastasia's actual inheritance forward regardless, training the very man who would eventually destroy everything Gambino had built through a return to exactly the kind of open, theatrical violence his own mentor had once perfected. The organization's entire subsequent history, examined honestly, reveals itself as a permanent, unresolved tension between these two competing traditions, one careful and hidden, one loud and violent, both tracing back through the same specific bloodline of mentorship and inheritance. This account has now followed across 3 full generations of leadership. This generational inheritance ultimately reveals something considerably more significant than a simple curiosity of organized crime history. It demonstrates that Anastasia's own specific character, the volatility, the theatrical menace, the willingness to treat violence as a demonstration of personal power rather than simply a tool of careful business calculation, never actually disappeared from this organization's culture at all. It went underground for 2 decades, carried quietly by a single underboss who had learned it firsthand, before resurfacing fully formed in the next generation's boss, proving that the specific character traits this account has traced, defining Anastasia's entire adult life, were never simply eliminated by his own violent death. They were inherited, refined, and eventually deployed again, decades later, by a man who had never met Anastasia personally, but who had absorbed everything that mattered about him through the careful, patient mentorship of a single intermediary who had once stood close enough to watch him work. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final section of this account draws together everything this history has traced and asks what Anastasia's entire life actually reveals about the world the films never got right. Section 10. What the executioner actually built. Albert Anastasia's life resists the kind of clean, contained moral shape audiences generally expect from stories about organized crime, and understanding exactly why requires returning to the earliest moment this account examined. A 15-year-old boy walking off a freighter in Brooklyn with nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever hardness the years aboard that ship had already carved into him. That boy became, within a matter of years, a convicted murderer sentenced to death, and the specific mechanism through which he escaped that sentence, witnesses recanting or simply disappearing before they could ever testify against him, established a pattern he would repeat, with mechanical, almost bureaucratic consistency, across the following 3.5 decades of his adult life. This account has now traced that pattern through every major chapter of his career, and returning to it here, with the full arc finally visible, reveals something considerably more disturbing than any single killing examined in isolation could have suggested on its own. What makes Anastasia's story worth measuring against the popular, romanticized version of organized crime that films have spent decades presenting to audiences is the sheer, accumulated weight of exactly how many times this same pattern actually repeated itself across his entire career. This was never a single dramatic betrayal or a single moment of unforgivable excess that shattered an otherwise functioning code of honor. This was a man who built an entire professional identity and eventually an entire industrial operation, employing dozens of specialized killers, around the specific insight that American justice depended entirely on witnesses willing to testify and willing to survive long enough to do so, and who spent every subsequent year of his adult life exploiting that exact vulnerability with a thoroughness that eventually made him one of the most feared and most successful criminals in the entire history of the country. Consider what Murder Incorporated actually represented. Examine now against the full arc this account has traced across its preceding sections. This was not a loose collection of angry men occasionally settling scores when circumstances demanded it. This was a centralized, professionally managed enterprise. Contracts distributed according to specific criteria, killers selected for their lack of personal connection to intended targets, weapons disposed of immediately following each job, an operation that conservative estimates place responsible for somewhere above 500 killings across roughly a decade of active operation, with some historians suggesting the true figure may have exceeded 1,000 once every contract carried out across the entire country is properly accounted for. Anastasia sat near the very top of this structure, and the specific discipline he brought to protecting both himself and the broader enterprise from prosecution represented, in its own dark way, a genuine managerial achievement, a demonstration of exactly how thoroughly criminal enterprise could be organized, along lines that would have been recognizable to any legitimate business owner managing a specialized workforce, if that workforce happened to specialize exclusively in ending human lives on contract. The killing of Abe Relis deserves particular weight in any final accounting of what Anastasia's life actually reveals, because it illustrates something this broader history of organized crime has traced repeatedly across other criminal cultures examined in entirely separate work. The way even the most careful, most seemingly comprehensive institutional protection the state could construct around a witness proved, in this specific case, entirely insufficient once the interests threatened by that witness's testimony decided his continued survival had become unacceptable. 6 police officers guarded Relis around the clock inside a supposedly secure hotel suite, and he died anyway, hours before testimony that would have connected Anastasia directly to specific murders in a way no prior prosecution had ever managed to achieve. The phrase that emerged from this specific case, "the canary who could sing but couldn't fly," captures something considerably darker than simple gallows humor. It captures a genuine, documented demonstration of exactly how far organized crime's reach actually extended, defeating not merely ordinary witnesses too frightened to testify, but a fully institutionalized, supposedly comprehensive system of police protection specifically designed to prevent exactly this outcome. And then there is Arnold Schuster, the detail this account has already examined that separates Anastasia's own specific character from almost every other organized crime figure this broader history has traced across its extensive examination of different criminal cultures and different decades. Popular imagination surrounding organized crime consistently assumes some rough, unwritten boundary protecting ordinary civilians who have no direct connection to the criminal underworld, a limit that even men fully capable of extreme violence within their own professional context generally chose to respect, understanding that killing innocent, uninvolved people invited exactly the kind of sustained public and law enforcement attention that made continued criminal operation considerably more difficult for everyone connected to the underworld. Anastasia ordered the death of a 24-year-old clothing salesman, according to the most widely credited account of the killing's origin, purely out of irritation at watching him discuss his own role in a bank robber's capture on television. Whatever the precise, fully verified motive behind that specific killing, and this account has already acknowledged the genuine uncertainty surrounding Valachi's second-hand testimony regarding it, the underlying willingness to cross this particular line, and to cross it over something this genuinely trivial, illustrates a character considerably darker than anything the more romanticized tradition of organized crime storytelling has ever been willing to depict with comparable honesty. The specific chain of betrayal this account has traced across Anastasia's rise and fall deserves one final direct examination here, because it reveals a pattern considerably larger than any single relationship or any single organization. Anastasia rose to power by removing Vincent and Philip Mangano, presenting the commission with an account that implied justification without ever actually admitting guilt. He died through almost exactly the same mechanism applied against him in turn, a patient, coordinated conspiracy involving his own trusted underboss, executed with sufficient professional discipline that the actual triggerman escaped identification entirely. Carlo Gambino, having betrayed the man who trusted him most intimately, went on to build 2 decades of genuinely successful, genuinely respected leadership, dying peacefully in his own home, while Anastasia himself lay in a mirror-lined barbershop, cut down mid-shave. And the very organization Gambino built through this careful, patient discretion eventually produced, through Aniello Della Croce's own direct inheritance of Anastasia's methods, the man who would tear it all down again decades later. John Gotti, ordering Castellano's own assassination in almost precisely the same manner Anastasia and Gambino had once applied against their own predecessors. This is, ultimately, why the story this account has traced across these 10 sections deserves to be measured directly against the far more sentimental, far more romanticized version of organized crime loyalty and honor that popular film has spent decades presenting to audiences. The Godfather, and the wider tradition of storytelling it inspired, offers viewers a world built around family loyalty, careful codes of conduct, and violence deployed only reluctantly, as a last resort against genuine threats, rather than as a casual, almost recreational response to minor personal irritation. That film's own most memorable moments derive their power precisely from the tension between the Corleone family's stated values and the violence they actually commit, a tension the narrative treats as genuinely tragic, a family forced by circumstance into choices that violate whatever better nature they might otherwise have possessed. Nothing in Anastasia's actual documented life offers this same tension, because nothing in his actual documented life suggests any better nature straining against the violence he chose to commit. He killed a fellow dock worker at 19, over competition for jobs, and escaped a death sentence through witness intimidation. He helped assassinate Giuseppe Masseria to secure his own position within a newly forming criminal order, then built an industrial killing operation that treated murder as an ordinary commercial transaction, contracts fulfilled, and payment collected, with the same procedural detachment a legitimate business might apply to any other service. He killed his own boss, or arranged for his disappearance in a manner that left no body for investigators to examine, to seize control of an organization for himself. He ordered the death of an innocent civilian over wounded pride at seeing himself indirectly criticized on a television broadcast. And when the specific machinery of betrayal he himself had perfected across decades of practice finally turned back against him, orchestrated by his own trusted underboss working in coalition with men whose grievances against him had accumulated for years, he died in a barber's chair, wrapped in hot towels, lunging in his own final, disoriented moments, at reflections in a mirror, rather than at the actual men who had come to kill him. What remains, examining Anastasia's full trajectory from a poor, fatherless boy in Calabria through decades of documented murder, and finally into a public assassination that generated genuine relief across both the criminal underworld and law enforcement circles who had spent decades failing to hold him meaningfully accountable for anything, is a story that offers considerably less romance and considerably more discomfort than anything the popular cinematic tradition surrounding organized crime has ever attempted to depict. The Godfather gave audiences a family bound together by loyalty and tradition, however imperfectly that loyalty and tradition actually held up under pressure within the narrative itself. Anastasia's actual life offers no comparable bond worth examining with any genuine nostalgia or admiration. It offers instead a chain of betrayals stretching across generations, Anastasia betraying the Mangano brothers, Gambino betraying Anastasia in turn, and the entire organization Gambino subsequently built, eventually consuming itself through exactly the same pattern decades later, once Paul Castellano's own underboss decided his boss had become more valuable dead than alive. This chain deserves to be understood as the actual defining feature of this specific criminal family's history, considerably more significant than any individual killing this account has examined along the way. Every single transfer of power within this organization, from its earliest days under the Mangano brothers, through Anastasia's own violent rise and equally violent fall, and continuing forward into the considerably later chapters this broader account has already traced, in entirely separate work covering Castellano, Gotti, and Sammy Gravano's own historic cooperation with federal authorities, followed the exact same underlying logic. A trusted subordinate, positioned close enough to observe his own boss's routines and vulnerabilities with genuine intimacy, eventually concluded that his own advancement depended on removing the very man who had elevated him, and acted on that conclusion with whatever combination of patience and violence the specific circumstances actually required. Anastasia earned his nickname, the Lord High Executioner, through decades of demonstrating exactly how far a man willing to kill, without hesitation, could rise within a world built on exactly this kind of calculated, transactional loyalty. He never seemed to fully grasp, despite everything his own life should have taught him, that the same calculation which had elevated him would eventually be applied to his own continued existence the moment his own usefulness curdled into liability. This is, in the end, The actual lesson underneath everything this account has traced across Anastasia's full story, considerably colder, and considerably more honest than anything the popular version of this world has ever been willing to show. The men who built these organizations spoke constantly of family, of loyalty, of a code binding them together more permanently than the ordinary self-interest governing most human relationships. Anastasia's own life, examined honestly and completely, demonstrates exactly how hollow that language actually was. A man who killed his way to power, ruled through open terror for 6 years, and died at the hands of the very structure his own methods had first helped build. Betrayed by the underboss he had trusted most, in a barbershop chair, grasping at mirrors while the men who had actually come for him walked calmly back out into the street. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.